all the online students, good afternoon to all of you. Kindly give me a confirmation if it is audible to all the online students. All right. So yesterday I gave a question to all of you. At the commencement of the constitution, we had certain number of articles, parts, and schedules in the constitution. Now, how many of you have researched as to what is the number of articles, parts, and schedules presently? I just online students, you can just put your answers in the comment box. At the commencement, that is on 26th January 1950, we had 395 articles, 22 parts, and 8 schedules. I'll also let you know as we progress what do you mean by article, schedule, and a part. But presently, as of today, what is the answer? Who is willing to give the answer? Please raise your hand. Yes. 448 articles, 25 parts, 12 schedules. Any other answer? Where did you refer this? In Google. And Google may not be always the updated one, because a lot of amendments are happening, number of new articles were added, and you never know whether that has been taken into account. Any other differing opinion as to how many articles are there today? There are a number of articles has been repealed, number of new articles has been inserted. Say, for example, the 104th Constitutional Amendment Act has recently inserted one more new article, say, for example, Article 342A, which may not be taken into account by Google. So in this way, number of articles might have been updated. So as of today, we have got 467 articles. 467 articles, but your schedules and your parts were right. 467 articles, and we have 25 parts and 12 schedules today in the Constitution of India. Now, all these things has been because of the various amendments that has happened to the Constitution. All right. So with that answer, I'll just proceed further. So has anyone got any questions very quickly? First couple of minutes in whatever we have seen yesterday. So just to reiterate, we have seen as to what is the Constitution. It may not be an authentic one. So you'll have to go through the Constitution of India, and then you'll have to read it one by one as to what is the exact number of articles. And while reading the article, suppose let us assume Article 39 is there, and then Article 39 capital A, if it is there, that has to be counted as a separate article. 31 is there, which has been repealed from the Constitution, which was earlier a fundamental right, but there's Article 31A, capital A, 31 capital B. Now all these things has to be counted as a separate article. So it's just a mistake, probably whoever has put that. So you'll have to go through the, I would say the original Constitution or the Bare Act to understand, and that should be an updated one. So whatever Constitution amendment has been incorporated, you will get the right thing. All right, so any questions in your understanding of what is a constitution, what is constitutionalism, what constitutes a state, what is the difference between what is the difference between a written and an unwritten constitution? Then we try to understand the concept of democracy, the other forms of government apart from democracies, distinction between a direct and an indirect democracy. And then we have seen the parliamentary democracy. Just before I proceed, can anyone tell me in one single line, what do you understand by parliamentary democracy? What is the very essence or what is the very crux of parliamentary democracy? The executives are continuously accountable to the legislature. Very good. That's a very crux, and this theme has been repeatedly asked in the examination. And how the executives are continuously accountable to the legislature? Because they are always supposed to maintain a majority. On the contrary to the parliamentary system, although we do not have that particular system, but you should have an idea of this. There is also something which is called as a presidential system. In India, what we have? Our constitution provides for what is called as a parliamentary system, but on the contrary, across the world, some of the constitution also have what is called as a presidential system. Say, for example, in United States of America, they have this presidential system. Now, what is the basic crux or difference between a parliamentary system and a presidential system? In India, do we have a president? Who is the head of the union executive in our country? We have seen that the executives are there. We have executives at the union level, we have executives at the state level as well. But in India, we do have a president, we do have an elected president. Is the president elected directly or indirectly? Indirectly, but we do have a president. So if I ask you this particular question, who is considered to be the head of the union executive? Who is the head of the union executive? It is the president who is the head of the union executive. But then the president in India, if you see the president in India, he is also called as what? The president of India is just a nominal executive. What do you understand by the word nominal? Nominal means just for namesake. There is no real powers which are vested in him. He is just a executive or the head for the namesake. But the real executive is whom in our country? It is the Prime Minister who is heading the Council of Ministers. Of course, there are other ministers apart from the Prime Minister, but the real executive lies in the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers. Because India is what? India is a parliamentary system. In a parliamentary system, the real power is where? In the hands of the parliament. Although the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers can exercise a power, but they are continuously accountable to the legislature. That's why we say that it is a parliamentary system. On the contrary, in USA, there is a presidential system. There they do have a president. But the president there is the real executive. Here, he is a nominal executive in case of India. So who is the real executive there? The president is the real executive. But that does not is the exact difference between as to why they are called as a presidential system. What is the crux of the parliamentary system, I said? The executives are accountable to the legislature, which means the executive should always have a majority. So today, what is the majority they should maintain? They should always maintain this number 272 that we have already seen. So this much of majority they should always have. But whereas in a presidential system, the president is elected by the people. And then he will appoint his own ministers. They are in fact called as secretaries. They are not called as ministers in USA. They are called as secretaries. Secretary of Home Affairs, Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of Internal Affairs, whatever it is. So they are called as secretaries. And who picks these secretaries? The president makes his appointment. Now the real question is, once the president is elected in USA, is he need to have a majority in their legislature? Even in USA, they have a legislature. In India, we call that to be parliament. In USA, how that is called as? It is called as Congress. In India, what we call parliament. In USA, in their constitution, it is called as Congress. And their Congress also has two houses. One is House of Representatives. What is the other house? Senate. Like similar to that of the Rajya Sabha, they have Senate, and similar to that of the Lok Sabha, they have what is called as House of Representatives. They also have a legislature, similar to that of India. But then in India, we see that the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, that is the executive, is always accountable to the legislature because they always need to have a majority there. But in case of a presidential system, the president is independent of this legislature. The president, once elected, he doesn't have to have any majority. He doesn't have to prove any majority, or there is no need for the president to prove any majority or to continuously have the majority. So that means which system is more accountable? Which system do you think is more accountable? The parliamentary system. So in fact, in the Constituent Assembly, this debate has happened. Whether they were okay with the idea of democracy. But in USA also, they are a democracy. They have an elected president. In India also, we have elected government, which is in the form of the Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers. So the Constituent Assembly actually had this debate whether to go for a presidential system or a parliamentary system. There was mixed reactions in the Constituent Assembly. And ultimately, majority of the members were in favor of what? The parliamentary democracy. So what is the natural advantage of parliamentary democracy? The natural advantage of parliamentary democracy is that this system is more accountable because this government, despite it is formed, it continuously needs to have a majority. But whereas in a presidential system, once a president is elected, he doesn't have to have any majority. In fact, I'll give you an example. When Mr. Barack Obama was elected as a president, he was from the Democrat Party, majorly. But the number of representatives in the Democrat was far lesser than the Republicans. They have two major parties. So it doesn't need that the president have to maintain any majority in the legislature. So once elected, it is possible that the president will complete his tenure. The tenure of the president is there 4 years. So obviously this thing has been taken in account by the Constituent Assembly, and they have decided in favor of what? They have decided in favor of the parliamentary system. The parliamentary system is more accountable than the presidential system. And that is why our Constituent Assembly is chosen for the parliamentary system. But there's one disadvantage, which is an advantage in the presidential system. What do you think it could be an advantage in the presidential system? See, if there is a need to continuously maintain the majority, what could be the consequence? One is definitely it is more accountable. Can it have any impact on the stability of the government? Suddenly the majority is being taken away by the legislature, then the government has to fall. And then immediately you'll have to conduct elections. Will it have an impact upon the stability of the government? And it is also seen that the stability of any government is very important for development. So it was thought that whether stability is important or accountability is important. So the presidential system is seen as a more stable system, whereas the parliamentary system is seen as a more accountable system. So somewhere or the other, you'll have to decide that. But ultimately, the Constituent Assembly thought that the accountability is more important than stability. Being a nascent democracy, a new democracy, we wanted any government that is established, that government has to be a very stable government. It has to be a very accountable government. All right. So that's how ultimately they have chosen for what? They have chosen for what is called as a parliamentary system. Okay. So have you understood as to what is the difference between a parliamentary and a presidential system? Okay. Now come, let's move to the next thing in the syllabus. So write down the next topic, that is separation of powers. The next feature that probably you'll have to understand is what is called as the concept of separation of powers. Online students, is it clear to all of you? Okay, so some students are asking me that, sir, should we start studying Lakshmikant along your thing? Yes, of course, that's a very standard book. So, but I would say that clearly observe whatever is in their class, and if you want to simultaneously read that book, that is also perfectly fine. But we'll be covering most of the things. But sometimes the students think that I'm missing out on something. So probably if you want to have that, and you can study that simultaneously, no issues. All right. So write down the next thing, that is the separation of powers. So what exactly is the idea of separation of powers? Let us try to understand that. So do we have separation of powers in our constitution? So let us try to understand as to what is this concept of separation of powers. There are many thinkers who came out with this particular idea, but one thinker, a prominent philosopher, a French philosopher, Montesquieu, has put in forward this particular idea, which has been subsequently taken and incorporated in a number of constitutions across the world. So what basically is this concept of separation of powers? The idea of separation of powers is, suppose let us assume there is a constitution. Constitution is basically a rule book, and this rule book will say as to how the country is to be governed, who is supposed to do what, how you can impose limitations upon the powers of the state. And there are a number of things that has to be carried out simultaneously in the country. Now think that if all the functions are entrusted upon one single authority, there's only one authority who will make the law also, who will implement the law also, who will oversee whether the law is not violating the constitution also. If there's one single authority, is it correct, or the power will be distributed to different authorities? Which you think will be a different, better model? Distributed to different authorities rather than given to one single authority. What is the advantage of distributing this power, different nature of power, to different authorities? There will be a system of checks and balances. The system does not become arbitrary in nature. Okay, giving power to one authority is all right, but what if that authority turns out to be arbitrary? There has to be something to control that particular authority. So this was the idea of the political thinkers, that they thought that it is better that we always distribute the power between different organs of the state. And for which they came out with an idea of what is called as, most of the democratic constitution across the world, they come out with 3 different organs. I would say the organs to be legislature, the executive, and then something which is called as judiciary. So constitution with idea of separation of powers is nothing but distribution of powers between different organs of the state and entrust them with certain sets of responsibilities. And it is only that particular job they are supposed to do. Say, for example, the primary function of legislature, the number of function, I'm not talking about all the function. So the constitution has distributed the power between the different organs, and it also said, okay, this is your primary responsibility. You should not go beyond that. You have to do whatever is your responsibility. So what is the responsibility of the legislature as far as you know? The legislature is a law-making body. So it is your function to make laws. You make laws. And then they have brought in one different authority, which is also called as the executive. So what is your function? Primarily, you implement the laws. And I hope that you have a basic idea, a preliminary idea as to whom do I refer by the word legislature. It includes the parliament and the state legislature. So they primarily make laws. And you do understand when I use the word executives, it includes the prime minister, the council of ministers at the union level, including the president. And then at the state level, the chief minister and the council of ministers and the governor, who's all nominal executive. And then what is the prime responsibility of the judiciary? Judiciary is to basically to keep eye on the other two organs of the state. Okay, you are making law. It is your function to make law. It is your function to implement the law. But there has to be some reference point based on which they have to make the law. Or in other words, there's a boundary within which they have to make the law. Where that boundary is set? The Constitution of India. The Constitution of India is, of course, setting those boundaries. So what if any law is made by the parliament which is beyond the scope? Which is beyond the scope of what? Which is beyond the scope of what is given in the Constitution. What if they implement the law which is beyond the scope of what is given in the law? So there has to be some authority to declare all these things as null and void or ultra vires of the Constitution. So for that, a particular authority is given, and that is basically what is called as the judiciary. Or I would put it in a word which is called as judicial review. So what is their basic function? Their function is basically what is called as judicial review. Just write down a line as to what is judicial review, because you'll have to understand these things. What is the term judicial review? It is a power exercised by the judiciary. It is the power exercised by the judiciary by which it's the power exercised by the judiciary by which they can declare the actions of the legislature, within bracket you can write lawmaking, and the actions of the executive, within bracket you can write implementing laws, as null and void, if they are in violation of the Constitution. Now, that is a key word. When they can declare those actions to be null and void. What do you understand by the meaning null and void? Have you ever heard of this word, null and void? Null and void means the court is declaring that these actions will have no legal effect. If there's a law, if the court declares that law to be null and void, that law has no legal effect. If there's an executive action, if the law declares it to be null and void, it will have no legal effect. Okay, it cannot be implemented. But this can be done by the judiciary under only one circumstances, when it is in violation of the Constitution. So who is giving this? All the organs of the state the power, they are all deriving the powers from where? From the Constitution. And they have to basically function within the limits of the Constitution. So do you agree with the fact that the Indian Constitution provides for separation of powers? You clearly agree? There's a legislature, there's an executive, there's a judiciary. Okay, I'm just moving one step further now. I'm saying that the Constitution of India relies or based on the principle of strict separation of powers. That the Constitution of India relies upon what is called a strict separation of powers. So the answer to this question is yes or no. What would you say? This concept which is called as separation of powers. Separation of powers is basically that there are three organs where the power is distributed. But do you agree with the fact that the Indian Constitution provides for a strict separation of powers, or it does not provide for strict separation of powers? The Constitution of India does not provide for strict separation of powers. There's an element of separation of powers, but you cannot say that there's strict separation of powers. Why there is no strict separation of powers? Because there is some element of overlap between the legislature and the executive. Is there an overlap between the legislature and executive? When I say the legislature and executive, from where do the Prime Minister and the other Council of Ministers come in our country? They come from the legislature. From where do the Chief Minister and the Council of Ministers come? From the legislature. So there's some element of overlap. Of course, not the entire legislature is part of executive, but the executives do come from where? The legislature. There's some element of overlap. So you'll have to understand that although the Constitution of India provides for separation of powers, it does not rely upon the fact that there's a strict separation of powers. But whereas on the contrary, you take the example of United States of America. In USA, is there a strict separation of powers? In United States of America, I said that the president and the secretaries, are they part of their Congress? Are they part of their legislature? The legislature is a separate body. The executives are separate body. Judiciary is separate body. In India, the judiciary is separate, but there is some element of overlap between the legislature and the executive. So we do not rely on the fact that there's a strict separation of powers, but we do believe in the fact that there should be checks and balances. Okay, so there is no strict separation of powers. I would say that there's no strict separation of powers, but we do have this principle, but it is not strict. But we believe in the fact that there should be something which is called as checks and balances. Now we'll have to understand how those checks and balances exist. Checks and balances means how one organ of the state can have some element of control over the other organ. So do we have that? So that is what we are going to see. So how that control is established, let us try to understand. Is there any element of control of the legislature over the executive? How the legislature can have control over the executive? The legislature can have control over the executive because they should always have a majority. The executive always need to have a majority where? In the legislature. Whenever the majority is lost, then the executives will be dismissed. So the legislature has some element of control over the executive. Now let us see how the judiciary is having element of control over both the executive and the legislature. Now you see how the judiciary is having control over the executive and the legislature. The judiciary, can they declare the actions of executive as null and void through the process of judicial review? Can the judiciary declare the actions of the legislature as null and void through the process of judicial review? So here you see that the legislature is having control over the executive, the judiciary is having control over the legislature, the judiciary is also having control over the executive. Now does the legislature have any control over the executive? Sorry, over the judiciary? Checks and balance means everybody should have some control so that nobody is a Frankenstein monster, that everybody functions within certain limitations. Is there any element of control that the legislature can exercise over the judiciary? When I say legislature, can the parliament exercise any control over the judiciary? Is that possible? How? No, the judiciary mostly derives their power from the constitution. And if a law is made by the parliament which is trying to take over the power which is given to the judiciary by the law, which can be struck down by the courts, is there any element of control that the legislature can have over the judiciary? The judiciary comprises of what? The judges. The judges can be removed by the parliament. So if the judges are functioning arbitrarily, the judges can be removed by the parliament has to pass a motion and ultimately it will be signed by the president. But then who has the authority? The parliament can do that. The parliament can initiate that particular process. Okay. So they have a very important role here if you see in the removal of the judges. The removal of the judges. So this is what is called as a system of checks and balances. So do you understand? So if you have to understand, the constitution does not allow for what? The constitution does not provide for strict separation of powers, but it is relied on the fact that there is an element of what is called as checks and balances. So checks and balances means that is certain element of control that one organ of the state can exercise over the other organ. But there is no clear separation of powers because of the fact there is some element of overlap between what? The legislature and the executive. Is that clear to all of you? So this is basically what is called as the separation of powers. Any questions with regard to the idea of separation of powers? Is that clear to all of you? The executives have not much control, because you should always see, for a democracy to function, the executive should not have the highest power. Rather, the parliamentary democracy, the parliament should be very powerful. The executives are nothing but a committee of people from the legislature. So the executives will not have any control over the legislature. But yes, executive may have some element of control over the judiciary, because the executive will make the appointment to the judiciary as per the constitution. Who appoints the judges? The president has to appoint the judges. So the president is part of what? The executive. Although now it has gradually gone for some change. So those who got some idea about how the constitution has gone for a change, there's something which is called as today the collegium based appointment. I do not know how many of you are aware of that, but I'll discuss that at the later stage. But who is to appoint the judges? The president of India. So to that extent, but it is not that the executives can make the legislature accountable. The legislature is a supreme body. In fact, the executives are nothing but the representatives of the legislature. So this is how the system of checks and balances. But rather, the judiciary will have control over both the things in the checks and balances. Is that clear to all of you? So what is the idea of separation of powers? Let me just quickly summarize. So separation of powers is an idea that there will be different organs, and each and every organ have a specific function to perform. But then if you look into the Indian constitution, there's no clear separation of powers, because there's some element of overlap between the legislature and the executive. But however, we do have proper system of what is called as checks and balances, where one organ will have an element of control over the other organ. So that's basically the idea of what is checks and balances. Is that clear to all of you? So please come to the next topic, that is federal political system. Write down the next thing, that is federal political system. Federal political system, or we are going to understand a concept what is called as division of powers. We're going to understand a concept which is called as division of powers. Division of powers. Okay, have you ever heard the word that India is a federal political system? Have you ever heard of this particular term? The contrary, because we have seen that something which is a parliamentary democracy, what is against a parliamentary democracy is a presidential system. So similarly, if you talk of something which is called as a federal political system, what is the concept that is against the federal political system? There is something which is called as unitary political system. But then India is a federal political system. There's a lot of criticism to this idea, because somebody say that India is not truly federal political system. India is a federal political system with unitary bias. All those things are there. But we are just trying to understand as to what is a federal political system. So what do you mean by federal political system? A federal political system means there is also something which is called as division of powers, or to put it in one single word, there is something which is called as decentralization. A federal political system will always go for what is called as decentralization. Against a federal political system, there is something which is called as unitary political system. These two things are different from one another, or exactly opposite in terms of concepts. Where this unitary political system goes to the idea of what is called as centralization. So in India, we have decentralization or we have centralization. Decentralization. So which means we'll have to understand basically what is decentralization, or in other words, what is a federal political system. For which we'll have to understand. Okay, so in India, say for example, if you take the federal political system, we have India as an example, we have USA as an example. Can you give an example of some unitary political system? Example, you have United Kingdom, you have France, etc. So these are all examples. You have Sri Lanka, say for example. These are all examples of unitary political system. So let us now try to understand as to what is a difference between a federal political system and a unitary political system. Now, all these countries, they do have a constitution. So everything comes from what is called as a constitution. It is a constitution that makes India a federal political system. So what does it mean? When I say that the constitution is federal in character, that the constitution allows for what is called as decentralization. Suppose let us assume the constitution demarcates. The constitution is a source of authority between the different levels of government. So you have the central government here. Do we have a central government? And simultaneously, the constitution allows for what is called as a state government. Now, the point that you have to understand when I say it's a federal political system, the state governments are directly deriving the powers from where? From the constitution. The central government is directly deriving the powers from where? The constitution. The constitution will say what you are supposed to do. The constitution will say what you are supposed to do. That means the state governments are not at the mercy of the central government. They're not taking the powers from where? The central government, but they are directly deriving the powers from the constitution. That is what is called as a federal political system. That means there is division of powers between the different levels of government. There's division of powers between the central government and the regional governments. So that doesn't mean, it also means that the state governments are not subordinated to the central government because they derive directly the powers from where? The constitution. So that is exactly what you'll have to understand by a federal political system. So this is federal, but suppose let us assume a unitary political system on the other hand. Let us assume the constitution which is unitary in character. Let us assume a constitution is having a unitary character. In a constitution, so all the powers are given to one government. So that's why it is what is called as unitary, to the central government. So does it mean that in a unitary political system, there is no other government apart from the central government, or will there be governments apart from the central government? In a federal political system, definitely there will be multiple levels of government and they directly derive the powers from the constitution, at least between the central and the regional governments, the state governments. So in a unitary political system, all the powers are given to the central government. Will there be any other governments apart from this? Of course, there can be. There can be, but then the problem there is in a unitary form of government. Suppose let us assume that there is a regional or a state government below this. There is a regional government, let us assume. So in this case also there can be regional governments for the purpose of administrative convenience. But then the problem in unitary form of government is that the regional governments do not directly derive the powers from the constitution, but it is coming from the central government to the regional government. That means it is only by way of a delegation. It is not decentralization. So we call this decentralization because the powers are directly coming from the constitution. When we call delegation, do you know what is the meaning of the word delegation or delegated authority? Delegated authority means an authority which is having the power can transfer some of its power to another body. That's basically what is called as delegation. So where in a federal political system, there is no concept of delegation that makes the regional governments equally powerful. But whereas in case of a unitary political system, all the powers are entrusted where? In the central government. From the central government, some powers can be given to the regional governments. But then what is the problem here? And delegated authority can be taken back by the authority which is delegating that at any point of time. That means if the central government want, they can transfer 5 subject matters, 5 powers, and at any time they can take it back if they want. So that is what is the idea of unitary. That means they are trying to make one authority very powerful, and that is why it goes with the idea of centralization. Centralization. But the Constitution of India is based on the idea of what? Is based on the idea of decentralization, that is division of powers. Okay, I have just told about the central government and the state government, which is the executive authority at the union level and the state level. But do we have the legislature at the union level and the state level? We do have a legislative body at the union level, what it is called as the parliament. So the Constitution also gives what is the power of the parliament. That means on what areas the parliament can make laws. That is also specified in the Constitution. Do we have a legislative body at the state level? What that is called as state legislature. So the Constitution specifies as to on what are the areas on which the state legislature can make the laws. So ultimately all these details and all these powers are controlled by whom? The Constitution of India. So does it make the union more powerful than the states? In a federal political system, it can be more powerful, but whatever is the power that is given to the states cannot be taken away by the union. because who is guaranteeing those powers? It is the constitution itself. But in a unitary political system, all the powers are given to one authority, that is at the union level or at the central level. So that's a basic difference between what is called as centralization and decentralization, or that's a basic example between what is called as a federal political system and a unitary political system. So now tell me, why do you think that India has gone for a federal political system? So you should also ask this question. So does India has a federal political system or a unitary political system? A federal political system. Do you agree that we have a union government and you have various state governments? Do you agree that we have parliament and we have state legislatures? Is the state governments in our country subordinate to the union government? Definitely not. The state governments are not subordinate to the union governments, because the state governments directly derive the powers from where? From the constitution. Is the state legislature subordinate to the parliament? Definitely not, because the state legislatures directly derive the powers from the constitution. Now, can anyone think that why the Constituent Assembly has decided in favor of a federal political system? What could be the reason that we have gone for a federal political system? Very good. There are a lot of diversities that needs to be taken into account, and that could be better managed. One is diversity, but most importantly, India is a very big country. Very big country, and of course the diversity in terms of area also, it is very huge. And see, which I'll discuss later as we'll proceed, the constitutional developments that happened over a period of time. So how many of you agree with the word if I say that India is a borrowed constitution? You might have heard that India is a borrowed constitution. How many of you agree with the fact that India is a borrowed constitution? What is your view that when I say that India is a borrowed constitution? What is the understanding you say that when I say India is a borrowed constitution? Very good. So the Constituent Assembly has taken the ideas from a number of other countries of the world when the Constituent Assembly was drafting the constitution. But do you know that the bulk of the Indian constitution is still from the Government of India Act 1935? Have you ever heard of an act which is called as the Government of India Act 1935? Which I'll discuss in the subsequent classes. To put it in a very simple way, what exactly is this Government of India Act 1935? Now, this Government of India Act 1935 is like the Constitution of India before India became independent. Or to put it in a very simple way, I can say that this to be the Constitution of British India. India became independent in 1947. But then India, till that point of time, was controlled by the Britishers. So even at that time, there was a civilized way, there was a country was governed. So you need to have some constitution, is the Government of India Act 1935. Now, a bulk of the Indian constitution today is from the Government of India Act 1935. Although we have taken a number of provisions from the constitution like USA, let us assume from Canada or from the matter France, USSR, Ireland, Japan, South Africa, number of principles has been taken, but today the bulk of the constitution is framed where? The Government of India Act 1935. And this Government of India Act 1935, try to understand, this Government of India Act 1935 is the culmination of 200 years of constitutional development. Now, do you know when the Britishers entered India? In fact, they entered as traders. They entered as traders in the beginning of 17th century, let us assume. They entered as traders, and for the first 150 years, they were trying to consolidate themselves, and they looked into the wealth of India, and then they realized that there's a huge political potential as well, and then they started conquering India. And then they established some element of control over India after what is called as Battle of Plassey. Has anyone heard of this Battle of Plassey? Which year this Battle of Plassey has happened? It was in 1757. This was the first major battle that they have won in India, and that is when they started that yes, they can have political control over India as well. So starting from 1757, then initially who came as traders? When they came as traders, they established a company which is called as East India Company. And this company was mainly engaged in what is called as a commercial activity, to purchase the goods and to sell the goods. That's majorly was their work. But then after 1757, they also started to have some element of political control over India. They started to administer India. And once they were trying to have some element of political control over India, the first law that was passed by British Parliament to administer the East India Company was the Regulating Act of 1773. And then they brought in a number of reforms to reform this particular company. And then there was something which is called as Revolt of 1857. Do you know this Revolt of 1857? And so from starting, when they started their political control over India, the first phase of British control over India ended in what is called as 1857. So till that point of time, they believed in the idea of what is called as centralization. That means there was a central authority, so based on which they were trying to control the British India. But then through the central authority, they failed tremendously in the revolt of 1857. They never thought that there could be a revolt against the British control in India. And later they realized one of the biggest problem that they are not able to effectively control India because their powers were centralized. Then subsequently what they thought is, henceforth we'll have to go for decentralization. And then subsequently from 1857 till 1947, they ruled for almost another 100 years. And during the time, the idea of the Britishers as to how they have to rule India is through the process of what is called as decentralization. And this idea of decentralization was reflected in a number of acts that was passed by the British Parliament to govern India. And one such latest law that they have passed is the Government of India Act 1935. So in the Government of India Act 1935, already they came out with the idea of what is called as decentralization. And because the Constituent Assembly, when they came in 1946 and they were drafting the Indian Constitution, they already experienced how this decentralization can work well. So naturally they thought, for a big country like India, what would be better when India becomes independent, when India is going to have its own constitution, which model would work better? Would be decentralization. Now take the example that I have given. So I was given some examples of country which is having unitary political system. Can you give me the examples that you have written down? United Kingdom, France, Sri Lanka. See, these countries are size, you see the size of these countries. They are just like one state in India. And look at the size of India, probably a little bigger than one particular state. So they realize, the Constituent Assembly also, to govern a country as big as that India, which would be the better model? Will it be centralization or decentralization? Decentralization. Okay. So try to understand as to what is a federal political system. A federal political system is where there is division of powers between the central and the state authorities, where there is division of powers between the central legislature and the state legislature. That means the state authorities or the regional authorities are not subordinate to the central authority. They directly derive the powers from the Constitution of India. But whereas on the other hand, that means this goes with the strict idea of what is called as centralization. Decentralization. Whereas a view against this idea is what is called as unitary form of government, which goes with the concept of what? Centralization. What is the problem with centralization? That all the powers are entrusted upon one single authority. There can be other levels of government, but they only delegate the power. And what is the problem with the delegation? It can be taken back at any time. What is the advantage of decentralization? It is fixed in the Constitution itself. Okay, that's the understanding. Is it clear to all of you what is federal political system and how that is different from a unitary political system? Online students, I hope it is clear to all of you as to what is a federal political system and how that is different from a unitary political system. Now, the next thing that you are going to understand is that although India is a federal political system, we say that our federal political system has an unitary bias. That is again a feature of Indian Constitution. Nobody can deny the fact that India is a federal political system. And similarly, nobody can deny the fact that this federation is not a true federation. Or this federal political system is not a true federal political system. It's a federal political system with unitary bias. Or it is a quasi-federal system. Or it's a federal political system with centralizing tendency. So these are all various observations that various political scientists have made. I'm again repeating that nobody can deny the fact that India is a federal political system. But is it a true federation? When I say is it a true federation, when you call a federal political system to be a true federal political system, when there is equal division of powers between the center and the states. It has to be equal division of powers or it has to be more powers to the state. Either you give the power equally or more powers has to be given to whom? To the states, to the federating units. But whereas on the contrary, in the Indian federal political system, there is division of powers, no doubt about that. But who is having more powers? If you look into the entire provisions of the Constitution, you will have the center is far more powerful than the states. And that is why it is called as a quasi-federal political system. Okay, so write down one particular thing. Federation with political bias. Federation with unitary bias. Come to the next thing. There is division of power. But then we say that the Indian federal system is a federation with unitary bias. Just write down a line on that. Federation with unitary bias. The Indian Federation is also described, or the federal political system under the Indian Constitution is also described. The federal political system under the Indian Constitution is also described as federal political system with unitary bias. Federal political system with unitary bias is because of the fact, although there is division of powers, between the central and the regional authorities, between the central and the regional authorities, there is more power. Okay, although there is division of powers between the central and the regional authorities, the power is not divided equally. The power is not divided equally between the authorities. The power is not divided equally between the authorities. In fact, more powers has been given. More powers has been given to the central authority. More powers has been given to the central authority in comparison to that of the regional authorities. More powers has been given to the central authority in comparison to that of regional authorities. For example, write down 1 or 2 examples also. For example, under Article 3 of the Constitution. Anybody know what is this Article 3? Anyways, we are going to discuss that. If you know, can you just tell me? What is this Article 3 of the Constitution? Article 3 of the Constitution, just write down 1 line. Under Article 3 of the Constitution, the Parliament can unilaterally destroy the states. Under Article 3 of the Constitution, the Parliament can unilaterally destroy the states. Under Article 3 of the Constitution, the Parliament can unilaterally destroy the states. What does it mean when I say that the Parliament can unilaterally destroy the states? Do you mean that the Parliament will destroy the states? That means tomorrow if a new state is to be created, that can be unilaterally done by whom? So for example, the recent state that was created is the state of Telangana, which has been carved out from the state of Andhra Pradesh. Anybody from the state of Andhra Pradesh in this class? Online students, offline students? Telangana was created. Do you know that the Andhra Pradesh was not in favor of that? The Andhra Pradesh Legislative Assembly was not in favor of that. Where the elected representatives of Andhra Pradesh, were they able to stop it? Ultimately, no, because it is based on the will of the Parliament. So in a true federal political system means it cannot be done without the consent of the state. But here, although it is a federal political system, certain things can be unilaterally done by the Parliament. Anybody from the state of Uttar Pradesh? Okay, so already there's a lot of demand in Uttar Pradesh that the Uttar Pradesh has to be divided into a number of smaller states. Because I think certain part of Uttar Pradesh is considered to be more prosperous. I think the western Uttar Pradesh is considered to be more prosperous than the eastern Uttar Pradesh. So already there's a demand to create new states. The same goes with number of other states also today. If these things are to be done, tomorrow understand that politically, as per the Constitution of India, it can be unilaterally done by whom? By the Parliament. The states have no control over that. So in this way, do you understand that more powers are given to the Union? For what reason it has been given, we'll discuss that later. But this is one example. I just want to give another example. Write down Article 352 of the Constitution. Has anyone heard of this Article 352 of the Constitution? What does it provide for? This provides for what is called as the proclamation of national emergency. The President of India can declare what is called as the national emergency under Article 352 of the Constitution. Now, do you know that when the national emergency is proclaimed, what is the nature of political system in our country? We do have a federal political system. But when the national emergency is proclaimed, the Constitution automatically goes for a transformation. The Constitution goes for a transformation in itself. which is otherwise a federal political system, when the president proclaims a national emergency, have you ever heard of this word national emergency? Has a national emergency been imposed in our country at any point of time? Can you tell me how many times a national emergency has been imposed in our country? As online students also? How many times? Any idea? Once? More than once? 100 times? More than 100 times? So the answer is 1, 2, 3 and 4. What is the right answer? Multiple choice. 1, 2, 3 and 4. So the national emergency has been imposed 3 times so far. One in 1962 when there is war with China, 1971 war with Pakistan, and then in 1975 because of the internal reasons, which was done by Prime Minister Indira Gandhi in 1975. So far it has been imposed 3 times. But whenever the national emergency, it's a very big topic, we'll discuss that later. But what I'm trying to say is, whenever the national emergency is proclaimed by the President of India, the constitution goes for a transformation. How does it transform? Which is otherwise a federal political system. This federal political system becomes what? It becomes unitary in character. When it becomes unitary in character, who will become more powerful? When it becomes a unitary form of government, then it is the union authority which will become more powerful. It is a center which will become more powerful, which will deprive the states of all their powers. Otherwise, if there is no emergency, the state will exercise a power as per the constitution. But when the emergency is there, the constitution itself is saying that the states will be deprived of their power and all the powers can be taken up by the union authorities or the central authorities. So in this way, there are a number of other provisions. These are not just only 2 provisions, a number of provisions in the constitution that makes the center more powerful than the states. That's why we say that the kind of political system we got, although it is federal, it is not a true federation, or it is a federation with unitary bias, or it is a federation with centralizing tendency, or it is also called as quasi-federal in nature. Is that clear to all of you? So by this time, it should be very clear to all of you as to what is the concept of democracy, what is parliamentary democracy, what is separation of powers, and then the next thing that you have seen is federation with unitary bias. We have seen federation also, and then why the Indian Federation is called as federation with unitary bias. Okay, so come to the next thing, that is integrated and independent judiciary. Next thing that we want to discuss is that our constitution also provides for what? Independent and integrated judiciary. Independent and integrated judiciary. So I'll just break this into 2 things. One is independent judiciary. And then I'll go for integrated judiciary. What do you mean by independent judiciary? Can someone tell me? Working? Very good. Working independently, freely, I would say, without pressure from any of the other authorities. So who are the other authorities? We have seen in the separation of powers, there are 3 major organs of the state. What are the other 2 authorities apart from the judiciary? Executive and the legislature. That means the idea of establishing an independent judiciary in our country is that the judiciary should function in a free and fair manner. The judiciary has to ensure justice in our country, and for that particular matter, they should not be under any pressure from the other 2 organs of the state, be it the legislature or be it the executive. Say, for example, you and me as a citizen, can we file a case against the government? Is it possible? Of course, we can file a case against the government if our rights are violated by the state. We can knock the doors of the judiciary. So tomorrow, let us assume that recruitment is conducted, and then in the recruitment process which is conducted by the government, let us assume that there is an arbitrary recruitment process. So do you have the right to approach the courts? Which is basically violative of Article 16, which is a fundamental right. Because there should be equality of opportunity in matters of public employment. Okay, you are a very ordinary citizen. You are approaching the court and you are filing a case against the government. The government has very mighty in comparison to that of an ordinary citizen. So in that case, if the government is able to pressurize the judiciary, the judgment is always going to be in favor of whom? It is always going to be in favor of the government. Then as a citizen, how will you exercise and enjoy your rights? And for the very purpose, the Constituent Assembly wanted to have a judiciary which is independent in nature, which is to function without any fear or favor to any authorities. So that is why we have an independent judiciary. So independent judiciary means a judiciary which is free from the control of the other organs of the state. So now you ask me the question that how the judiciary is independent, what characters makes a judiciary independent? So independent means it should be free from the other organs of the state. It should be free from the pressure of the legislature or the pressure of the executives. So is there any provisions in the constitution that makes a judiciary really independent? So the very idea is to ensure justice, but how do you empower the judiciary? How do you make the judiciary really independent? There are some provisions in the constitution which does really make the judiciary independent. Now tell me, in the entire history of India, just listen to this, in the entire history of India, 1950 till 2024, it's almost a 75 years of journey. In the last 75 years of journey, tell me one instances where a judge of a Supreme Court or High Court has been removed. Can you give me one instance? A judge of a Supreme Court, the higher judiciary comprised of the judges of the Supreme Court and High Court, have they ever been removed? In fact, the legislatures can remove them if they want. There's a provision in the constitution. But in the last 75 years, not even a single judge has been removed because removing them is not an easy process. There is a process, but it is an extremely difficult process. We have seen that number of prime ministers have to demit their office because no confidence motion has been passed against them. And number of IAS officers, number of IPS officers and the bureaucrats has been removed. Number of chief ministers has been removed from their office. But tell an instance where a single judge of a Supreme Court or High Court has been removed has not happened in the history of India. We do not have any precedent. And that is the powerful, or that is how the position has been given so strong that the removal is extremely difficult. Now, why the Constituent Assembly has purposefully made the removal of the judges extremely difficult? Because they should work without any fear of the legislature and the executive. That doesn't mean that they cannot function, they can function arbitrarily. If they function arbitrarily, there's a procedure for the removal. But the procedure has been made extremely difficult. That is to ensure what? That is to ensure that they function independently. So independent judiciary is only meaning that they are free from the other two organs of the state. Now come to the concept of integrated judiciary. What do you mean by integrated judiciary? So independent judiciary, to put it in one single line, that the judiciary is free from the other organs of the state in terms of their functioning. So but what is an integrated judiciary? One single hierarchy of judiciary. So write down what is integrated judiciary. Integrated judiciary means one single hierarchy of judiciary. At the apex, you have got Supreme Court, and below the Supreme Court, you have High Courts for various states, and then below that, you have got what is called as the subordinate judiciary. There's just one single hierarchy of judiciary. There's no separate hierarchy. Try to understand. There's no separate hierarchy for the center, and there's no separate hierarchy for the states. Or there's no separate judiciary to conduct the trial for the laws passed by the state legislature and to conduct trials passed by the parliament. There's just one single hierarchy of judiciary. If you see some of the federal political systems, like in case of United States of America, there are separate hierarchy of judiciary. There's one central hierarchy, or I would say federal hierarchies, and for every state they have a different hierarchy of courts. But in India, do you have separate hierarchy of courts? There's only one single hierarchy of courts. All the high courts in the state, they come under the Supreme Court. And for every high courts, there can be number of other subordinate courts, like the district courts and the municipal courts and all those things. Okay, so only one single hierarchy of courts, which means it is an integrated judiciary. That means these courts can conduct the trial of law made by the parliament also, laws made by the state legislature also, but we have only one single hierarchy of judiciary. That's basically what you understand by integrated judiciary. Is it clear to all of you what is an independent and an integrated judiciary? Now, these are all the basic features that you have to understand. All right. So now we'll just quickly move to the next part. Is there any doubt, online students? Shall we move forward? Offline students? Can I have a better response? Yes. Can we move forward? Come to the next thing. That is the written constitution. What do you mean by a written constitution? So we have understood this in the last class itself. What is the idea of written constitution? A written constitution is a codified document. It is codified into a single constitution. What are the other features of written constitution that you have understood? It is codified into a single document. Codified into a single document, and apart from that, distinction between an ordinary law and a constitutional law. There is a distinction between constitutional law versus the ordinary law. So this distinction is there. So can someone tell me what is this ordinary law and what is this constitutional law? What is this distinction? Can you give me an example of an ordinary law? Anyone? The criminal laws in our country, the IPC, CRPC, the Right to Information Act. So these are all ordinary laws. Very good. So a written constitution will always have this distinction. And then we also seen whenever it is a written constitution, the written constitution is likely to be a rigid constitution. What do you understand by rigid constitution? Most likely, mostly, generally, it's a rigid constitution. What do you mean by rigid constitution? It is not easy to make changes to this constitution. It is not that changes cannot be made at all, but it is difficult to make changes to the constitution. And in this light, I have also asked the number of amendments that has happened to the constitution till this point of time. How many number of amendments has been made? 106 constitutional amendment has been made till this point of time. Very good. Now come to the next topic, that the Constitution of India has been drawn from multiple sources. So very quickly, I'll just move on to this particular area. As to when I say that the constitution has been drawn from multiple sources, or when I say that the Constitution of India is a borrowed constitution. You just have a basic idea. Say, for example, some of the important provisions today we have in the Constitution of India, the inspiration has been drawn from the other constitutions. Or I would say that the idea has been drawn from the other constitutions. Although in certain areas we have made our own changes, but the idea or the inspiration has been taken from the other constitutions. Say, for example, the Constitution of USA. So what is the idea that you have taken? The idea of fundamental rights. There in the United States Constitution, it is called as Bill of Rights, but we have made that as fundamental rights. And then there are a number of other provisions, but I'm just look into the crux of the provisions. Say, for example, United Kingdom. What is the major provision that you have borrowed? The idea of parliamentary system that we have today. Although there is certain element of differences between the parliamentary system in India and that of United Kingdom. Although we have borrowed the parliamentary system from the United Kingdom, there is a certain element of difference in our parliamentary system than that of United Kingdom. Does anyone know what is this difference? Okay, one is very good. Monarchy. They have a monarchy. We are a republic. What do you understand by monarchy? Their head of the state is through hereditary succession. Who is the head of the state there? King, or the queen is dead recently, so now it is the king. So before that it was the queen. So it is through a hereditary succession. Whoever becomes the head of the state. Who is the head of the state in India? The president. But then the president is through hereditary succession, or he is elected? Elected. In India, so try to understand, in republic means the head of the state is always elected. It doesn't mean whether it is a direct election or an indirect election. The head of the state is how one becomes head of the state. Always elected. That's basically republic. India as a republic, they are a monarchy. But then their monarchy is little different from the monarchy that was telling to Saudi Arabia. Remember in the yesterday's class, I was also making a reference to Saudi Arabia. So you are also calling United Kingdom as a monarchy. You are calling Saudi Arabia as also a monarchy. So what is the difference between these monarchies? UK? Very good. UK is a constitutional monarchy, whereas Saudi Arabia is an absolute monarchy. Okay. So make this distinction. There's a difference between the word absolute monarchy and there's something which is called as constitutional monarchy. Well, in the absolute monarchy, the real authority is a monarchy. In a constitutional monarchy, the monarchy is just a nominal executive. Nominal executive means he is not the real authority. Who is the real authority here in UK? The Prime Minister and the Council of Ministers, because they are also following a parliamentary system. Okay, so here in a constitutional monarchy, the monarchy is just a nominal executive for namesake. So here he is a real executive. All right, so that means in India, although we have a parliamentary system, but our parliamentary system is not exactly same as that of what? The British parliamentary system. So in the British parliamentary system, you try to understand that they are a monarchy, but we are a republic. So what does the term republic denotes? Election of what? Head of the state. It is not the government, right, to understand. So whenever you talk the question how the government is formed, then we talk about if the people are letting it, then that is democracy. Democracy is always associated with how the government is formed. But the term republic or the monarchy is associated with how one becomes a head of the state. Okay, in republic, it is always through elections. That's one difference. There's another important difference when it comes to the parliamentary system in India and that of the parliamentary system in United Kingdom. The number of differences. I'll also deal with this topic elaborately. There's one topic in your syllabus which is called as the comparison of constitution across the world. So there are also other differences between Indian parliamentary system and the parliamentary system of United Kingdom, which you need a little bit of more knowledge to comprehend those things. But then the basic fundamental idea of parliamentary system has been taken from where? It has been taken from the Constitution of United Kingdom. And then France, is there anything borrowed from the Constitution of France? The idea of justice, liberty, equality. So all these principles has been taken from the Constitution of France. So have we taken anything from the Constitution of Germany? The suspension of fundamental rights during emergency. Do you know that the fundamental rights can be suspended? We'll try to understand that when we take up the emergency provisions. The suspension of fundamental rights during emergency has been taken from the Constitution of Weimar. Weimar's constitution means Germany constitution. And then you have the idea of fundamental duties. Do you know from where the fundamental duties has been taken? S12 Constitution of USSR. The idea of directive principles of state policy from the Constitution of Ireland. So on and so forth. There are a number of other provisions which has been borrowed. But despite all these things, today the bulk of the Indian Constitution has been taken from where? It is from the Government of India. So I would say that the bulk of the Indian Constitution is from the Government of India Act 1935. The entire structure of Indian government, the ministries, the departments, the portfolio system, today we have got the Union Public Service Commission, the State Public Service Commission. Today we have got the bulk of the Indian provisions has been taken from the Government of India Act 1935. Okay, so all these things has been taken from the Government of India Act 1935. So this is just you have an idea that the constitution, why it is called as a borrowed constitution. So as we'll proceed, I'll also raise this historical underpinnings. There's a topic in your syllabus which is called as historical underpinnings. That means gradually how the constitutional developments have happened. So when I discuss the topic, maybe a couple of class later, I'll also explain you as to how we came to this Government of India Act 1935. After the Britishers entered into India in the 17th century beginning, they came as traders, and then by mid 1750s, the 18th century, they tried to have some element of political control over India. And then there was two phases of administration of British in India. The first phase of administration of the British in India, what is called as the company rule. And then the second phase of British administration in our country is what is called as the crown rule. Have you ever heard of this? Company rule and crown rule. So during this time, a number of developments, constitutional developments have happened. And then all those developments have finally resulted in one act which is called as the Government of India Act 1935. And then subsequently this was replaced by what? The Constitution of India. So the next thing that you have got is the Constitution of India. Okay, between the Government of India Act 1935 and the constitution came into force on 26 January 1950, there was also something which is called as the Indian Independence Act. And when was the Indian Independence Act was passed, based on which India was given the independence? 1947. So 1947, the Indian Independence Act was passed. So after the independence, before the commencement of the constitution, by which the independent India was governed? Was it based on the Government of India Act 1947 or any of the other act? Because 1947 we got the independence, but we didn't have a constitution yet, because the Constituent Assembly was still in the process of drafting the constitution. And then the constitution came into force when? Only on 26 January 1950. So 1947 and between 26 January 1950, India was governed by what? What was the constitution based on which the independent India was governed? It was still governed based on the Government of India Act 1935. Okay, so you have to understand the independent India was not governed based on Government of India Act 1947. It merely gave independence to India. So, but we still continued to be governed based on the Government of India Act 1935. So, it had a lot of influence. I'm trying to say it had a lot of influence in the Constitution of India, and a number of provisions from here was taken by the Constituent Assembly, put into the Indian Constitution. Okay, so that's the basic thing that you should remember under this particular topic. Come to the next thing, that is a rigid and a flexible constitution. The next feature of Indian Constitution, it is rigid as well as flexible. Rigid and flexible. Okay, so what is the basic thing that I said? In case of a written constitution, I said that the constitution is mostly rigid in character. But then the Indian Constitution is a combination. It is a mix of both rigid and flexible. What do you understand when I say it is rigid and flexible? Rigid means it's very difficult to amend. What do you mean by flexible? It is sometimes easy to amend. So rigid means it is difficult. Flexible means it's easy. When I say both rigid and flexible, it's a combination of rigidity and flexibility. Which means some of the provisions, if you see the unique feature of Indian Constitution, some of the provisions are very easy to amend, and some of the provisions are difficult to amend. So it is not in all the cases it is difficult, and it is not in all the cases it is easy. Okay, just write down a line on that. The Constitution of India, the Constitution of India, the Constitution of India is a right blend of rigidity and flexibility. The Constitution of India is a right blend of rigidity and flexibility in terms of amending the Constitution. In terms of amending the Constitution. In terms of amending the Constitution. That is some of the provisions in the Constitution. Some of the provisions in the Constitution can be easily amended. Can be easily amended by a simple procedure. Some of the provisions in the Constitution can be easily amended by a simple procedure. However, the procedure is extremely complex. However, the procedure is extremely complex to amend the other provisions or to amend certain other provisions. Some of the provisions can be easily amended by a simple procedure. However, to amend certain other provisions, the procedure is extremely complex. The procedure is extremely complex. Or in other words, some of the provisions of the Constitution, can be amended by a simple majority. Whereas the other provisions can be amended only by a special majority in the parliament. some of the provisions can be amended by simple majority, whereas the other provisions can be amended by a special majority in the parliament. Special majority in the parliament. Of course, you know who has authority to make changes to the constitution? The legislature. And in the legislature, is it both a legislature? Is it both a parliament and the state legislature? Or is it only the parliament? Who has got the authority to make changes to the constitution? Only the parliament or both the parliament and the state legislature? So just think about this. Both the parliament and the state legislature are lawmaking body. Does both of them have the power to make changes to the constitution, or is it only the parliament? As per the Constitution of India, only the parliament has the power to make changes to the constitution. And when the parliament is making changes to the constitution, certain things can be done by a simple majority, certain things requires a special majority. So right now, do not worry about this majority. In the next class, I'll explain about the different types of majority and what is the distinction between these majorities. But right now, understand one thing. Simple majority means it's a simple procedure. It's easy to accomplish. But special majority means it's a complex procedure. It's not that easy to accomplish. Is it clear to all of you? Is it clear to you? What is your name? Sit. From Nohaland. Is it clear to all of you? Is it clear whatever you are teaching? What about you there in the last row? What is your name? What is your name? No, you. Ah, yes. Remove. Is it? Move. Okay. So is that clear to you? Are you getting all the things? All right. So that means if you look into the Constitution of India, in the Constitution of India, some things can be easily changed. Certain things are very complex to change. All right. So come to the next feature. What is the next feature that is given? Fundamental rights. So write down the next thing. Fundamental rights. Okay, before I go to the fundamental rights, what is the idea of rights? So many times you might use this word that it is my right. What do you understand by the word rights? And then let us discuss what is fundamental right. It is a online students, you can also put it. What do you understand by the word rights? Just the rights. How do you define it? How do you put it in one single word? Entitlements, very good. Can you say rights are nothing but your entitlements? Or you can say it is your privileges or claims or your immunities, whatever it is. To put it in a very simple way, rights are nothing but what? Your claims and entitlements, you can probably exercise from the constitution or by the ordinary laws of the land. These are something that you can exercise and enjoy. Basically, that is the right. So that means, why this concept of right? Why that as an individual we need to exercise certain rights? Right means once it is an entitlement of you, that means others cannot encroach on this. That is protecting you. It may be empowering you based on those rights. So as a civilized society, and it also goes with the idea of what we have discussed is what is called as the idea of constitutionalism. The idea of constitutionalism means what? That there has to be some limitation upon the powers of the state. And one way of putting limitation upon the powers of the state is by empowering the citizens with certain rights, having certain entitlements. They have something to claim against the state. So I would say rights are nothing but these are claims or entitlements we as a citizen can have. But among these rights, there are different types of rights, which I'll subsequently discuss. But among the most type of rights, the most important thing is that of the fundamental rights. So fundamental rights are also, these are entitlements. These are the claims that you can have. These are the things that you can exercise and enjoy. But what is the meaning of the word fundamental? Why they are called as certain rights are called as fundamental rights, and where these fundamental rights are guaranteed? It is guaranteed in the constitution. To be very specific, where it is guaranteed in the constitution? I said we have seen that there are 25 parts in the constitution. Do you know in which part of the constitution these are guaranteed? Very good. It is guaranteed in the part 3 of the constitution. So rights generally means entitlements or claims, but then fundamental rights are slightly above the concept of rights. It's a subset of rights, but there are different other types of rights. But right now we are concerned with the concept of what is called as the fundamental rights. So the first question is where these fundamental rights are guaranteed. It is guaranteed in Part 3 of the Constitution. So right from Article 12 to Article 35. So what are these fundamental rights? If you see these fundamental rights, that these are the most essential rights that would allow an individual to have a dignified human survival. Dignified human survival. So what are fundamental rights? There can be different types of rights, but among the rights which has been given the topmost priority, the fundamental rights, and they are enshrined in the Constitution itself, and to be very specific, in Part 3 of the Constitution. Now, say for example, if you take the Constitution, there can be certain rights outside Part 3 of the Constitution. That means outside this Article 12 to Article 35, probably in certain other rights, but they are not called as fundamental rights. Say for example, under Article 326 of the Constitution, I already discussed a particular right. Article 326, do you know which right it gives? Yesterday used the word universal adult suffrage. Do you remember universal adult suffrage? I think I didn't use the article, but I used the word universal adult suffrage. What does it mean by universal adult suffrage? That every adult individual shall have the right to vote. So that means Article 326 says that every adult individual shall have the right to vote. That means it is giving the right to vote. So right to vote is also coming from the Constitution. But is that a fundamental right? Is that a fundamental right? How many of you say it's a fundamental right? Please raise your hand. And how many of you say, no, it is not a fundamental right? So be frank about that. Okay, it's a fundamental right. Anybody who is saying that it is not a fundamental right? Please raise your hand. It's not a fundamental right? Okay, if it is not a fundamental right, then what kind of right is that? How do you say that? It is also a right, but you say whatever is there in Part 3 as a fundamental right. So fundamental rights are given a higher degree of importance. It's only in terms of degree. All the rights are important, but within that there are certain degrees of importance. So which is given the highest degree of importance? The fundamental right. Because the Constituent Assembly felt without these fundamental rights, it's impossible for an individual to have a dignified human survival. To have the basic essential in his life will be possible only if these fundamental rights are guaranteed. And try to understand this, the right to vote is not a fundamental right because it is not there in the Part 3 of the Constitution. The right to vote is a constitutional right. The Constitution is guaranteeing that, but it is not a fundamental right. But whatever is given in Part 3 of the Constitution, those rights are fundamental rights. So what difference does it make? By distinguishing, by giving a greater degree of importance, there has to be some kind of difference. And I think you might also heard this particular word, wherever there's a right, there's a remedy. What do you understand by this maximum, wherever there's a right, there's a remedy? Very good. So wherever there's a right, there's a remedy means whenever there's a violation of the right, the affected individual can seek the remedy in a court of law, or in other words, it is justiciable in a court of law. You can make an application, you can move an application, you can make a petition, you can file a petition in a court of law and seek the remedy for the violation of the rights in a court of law. So wherever there's a right, be it a fundamental right, be it a constitutional right, whenever the right is violated, you can seek a remedy. So right always comes with what is called as the remedy. But now, what is the difference when I say when it is a fundamental right? And then right to vote is just a constitutional right, or right to vote is a constitutional right. Can you give me an example of fundamental right? Any one fundamental right? Right to equality or right to freedom of speech and expression, which is very controversial today. Okay, suppose let us take two examples in this class. Suppose let us assume any one volunteer, please raise your hand. I'm not going to ask you any question, just probably your name at the maximum. So don't worry about that. Any one volunteer, please raise your name. What is your name? Ria. So Ria's right to vote is violated. So you are going to the polling booth on the day of election. So which phase the election is coming? Any idea in your place? You are coming from Uttar Pradesh. So your constituency, in which phase it is coming for election? No idea. No idea. All right, let us assume that it is coming in the second phase. I'm not sure, probably. Second phase election is on April 26th. Let us assume that. What is your name? Agastdeep Das. Akashdeep Das. Okay. So Akashdeep Das wanted to write an article in the editorial of a very popular magazine. And or let us assume that he wants to become an author. And he has a very radical idea. And he has all made and he has published a book. And that book has been banned by the state. What the government is telling? The government is telling that we will not allow you to sell the book inside India. Probably if you want to sell, you can sell it outside India. So in your case, you are going to vote on 26th of April and you are right to vote. The polling officer there is saying that no, Ria, you are not allowed to vote. You are not entitled to vote, despite the fact that you are having a voter ID card. So in both of your cases, your rights are violated. So your right to vote is violated. Your right to freedom of speech and expression is violated. Because right to freedom of speech and expression means you can express your ideas, you express your viewpoints, your thought process in whichever way you want. It can be in the form of writing, picturing, printing, through oral expression, whatever be it. So in your case, your constitutional right is violated. In your case, your fundamental right is violated. So do both of you have the right to seek remedy? Both of you have the right to seek remedy. But however, the Constituent Assembly thought in both the cases remedy is there, but which requires the immediate attention of the courts. Is it the fundamental right or is it the constitutional right? The Constituent Assembly thought it is the fundamental rights. That means in both the cases you can approach the courts. But in case of, can you please repeat your name? Sorry. Akashdeep Das. In case of Akashdeep Das, I will mention it as Das, okay, don't mind. So in case of Das, he can directly approach the Supreme Court of India. But in case of Ria, Ria cannot approach the Supreme Court of India directly because her fundamental right is not violated. Probably at the max, what Ria can do is Ria can approach the High Court. Suppose if she is not happy with the High Court, then you can, by a way of an appeal, you can go to the Supreme Court. But Akash, he can directly approach the Supreme Court of India. So in this way, whatever is the fundamental right, which is given in part 3 of the Constitution, the idea is that it is the most important right of an individual, because without that right, an individual cannot have a dignified human survival. His existence itself becomes a question mark. So in this particular case, he is directly allowed to knock the doors of the highest court of India, that is the Supreme Court of India. But whereas in other rights, you cannot approach the Supreme Court because there's only one Supreme Court, the highest court. For each and every right, you cannot go there because the Supreme Court will look into only the important matters. But of course, you can also approach the Supreme Court, but not directly by a way of an appeal. Suppose you go to the High Court of Uttar Pradesh, which is in Lucknow, I think. Where is the High Court? Sorry, Allahabad. So you go to Allahabad and then Allahabad High Court passes an order. You are not happy with that order. You can further make an appeal in the Supreme Court, but not directly. So try to understand what is the difference between a constitutional right or for that matter, the other rights. Whereas in case of violation of fundamental rights, you can directly knock where? You can directly go to the Supreme Court of India. But whereas in other courts, whereas in case of the other rights, including a constitutional right, there is also something which is called as legal right, which is subsequently discussed. You cannot directly approach the Supreme Court of India. You will have to go through the ordinary hierarchy of courts, because the fundamental rights are given the highest importance. Okay, that's basically what is the fundamental rights. Okay, so just write down a line on the fundamental rights. Fundamental rights are those rights which are guaranteed in part 3 of the Constitution. Fundamental rights are those rights which are guaranteed in part 3 of the Constitution. Right from Article 12 to Article 35. 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 These are rights in the opinion of Constituent Assembly. These are rights in the opinion of the Constituent Assembly that are very essential, that are very essential for the dignified survival of the human beings. These are rights which are very essential in the opinion of Constituent Assembly for the dignified survival of human beings. For the dignified survival of human beings. And it is because of this reason, whenever a fundamental right is violated, the affected individuals can directly file a petition, under Article 32 of the Constitution, in the Supreme Court of India seeking a remedy. The affected individual can also file a petition. In the respective high courts, under Article 226 of the Constitution. The affected individuals can also directly approach the respective high courts under Article 226 of the Constitution. Which means the affected individual has an option. Of either approaching the Supreme Court. The affected individual has an option of either approaching the Supreme Court or the High Courts. Directly, respectively under Article 32 and 226. Respectively under Article 32 and 226. So do you understand what is the meaning of the last thing? See, try to understand whenever the fundamental right is violated, where an individual can directly go. The individual can directly knock the doors of the Supreme Court under Article 32. Suppose if that individual feels, suppose somebody is from, let us assume, Manipur, Nagaland, their fundamental right is violated. So they have to travel all the way to the Supreme Court, which is practically inconvenient for them. So if they want, they can do that. Otherwise, if they want, they can also directly approach the High Court also. That is up to them. But if they fail the matter, if they're not happy with the judgment which is given in the High Court, then they can make an application to the Supreme Court. But if they already moved the Supreme Court, then they cannot come to High Court. So it is for the individual to decide. Okay, so just write down one more line. So both the Supreme Court and the High Court has concurrent powers. In accepting petitions with regard to violation of fundamental rights. With respect to accepting petitions relating to violation of fundamental rights. Today, there are 6 themes of fundamental rights guaranteed in Part 3 of the Constitution. So today, if you look into the Constitution, how many themes of fundamental rights are guaranteed? I'm telling the themes, the major themes of fundamental rights. Just write down. Today, there are 6 themes of fundamental rights. So what are the 6 themes? So first, write down right to equality. Right to equality, that is from Article 14 to Article 18. So this itself is a major question that is repeatedly asked in the prelims examination. Article 14 to Article 18, that's the first theme of fundamental right. 2, right to freedom. Right to freedom, that is from Article 19 to Article 22. 3. Right against exploitation. That is Article 23 and Article 24. Right to freedom of religion. Article 25 to Article 28. Cultural and educational rights of minorities. Article 29 to Article 30. And of course, the last theme of fundamental right to constitutional remedies. That is Article 32. So there are 6 themes of fundamental rights that is guaranteed today. I'm just repeating that again. One is right to equality, Article 14 to Article 18. So we'll see this all these things elaborately when I take up the fundamental rights. But UPSC do ask this particular question. They ask you, say for example, equality before law and equal protection of law. This comes under which theme? Right to freedom of speech and expression, which comes under which theme? Child labor, which comes under which theme? So you should also, because every fundamental right falls under any of these major 6 themes. Okay, you should understand this. Right to equality, Article 14 to Article 18. Right to freedom, Article 19 to Article 22. Right against exploitation, Article 23 to Article 24. Right to freedom of religion, Article 25 to Article 28. Right to cultural and educational rights of minorities, Article 29 and Article 30. Right to constitutional remedy. So today we have got 6 themes of fundamental rights, but in the original constitution there was 7 themes of fundamental rights. So that means one particular theme has been now repealed from the part 3 of the constitution. It has been taken away from part 3 of the constitution. Do you know which theme has been taken away from the part 3? Right to property. But is it still part of the constitution? That means today right to property is still a right, but it is not a fundamental right. Because what did I say? What is a fundamental right? Anything which is there in part 3 of the constitution. Only those things which is there in part 3 of the constitution is a fundamental right. Outside part 3, they can still be a right, a constitutional right, but no longer a fundamental right. So write down one more line. The original constitution had 7 themes of fundamental rights. The original constitution had 7 themes of fundamental rights. The original constitution had 7 themes of fundamental rights. 7 themes of fundamental rights. But that is, so the original constitution had 7 themes of fundamental rights, including the right to property, right? Including the right to property under Article 31 of the constitution. Under Article 31, along with, write down like this, under Article 31 of the constitution, under Article 31 of the constitution, along with Article 19, Clause 1, Subclause F. The original constitution had 7 themes of fundamental rights, including Article 31, that is right to property, along with Article 19, Clause 1, Subclause F, which has been now repealed from Part 3 of the Constitution. That means it has been deleted from Part 3 of the Constitution by the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978. So when it has been taken away? By the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act in 1978. In 1978, it was done. And by the 44th Constitutional Amendment Act in 1978. Just write down one more information. Article 19, Clause 1, Subclause F has been completely removed from the Constitution. Article 19, Clause 1, Subclause F has been completely removed from the Constitution. What does it mean when I say it is completely removed from the Constitution? It is no longer mentioned anywhere in the Constitution. Okay, it is not there. It is no longer there in the Constitution. Article 19, Class 1, Subclass F has been completely removed from the Constitution or deleted from the Constitution, whereas Article 31 is replaced. Article 31 is replaced in the form of Article 300A. In the form of Article 300A. That means whatever is Article 31, Article 31 has been taken away from the Part 3 of the Constitution, and then it has been replaced by which article? By Article 300A. So right to property still continue to exist. Does it continue to exist? But outside Part 3 of the Constitution. So that means right to property is no longer what? It is no longer a fundamental right, but still guaranteed in the Constitution. It is still guaranteed, but it is no longer a fundamental right. That means what is the basic difference that you should have? Before 1978, if the right to property of any individual is violated, they will be directly able to approach the Supreme Court of India. But today, if the right to property is violated, that is post 1978, will they be able to directly approach the Supreme Court? Will they be able to approach the courts? They can still approach the courts. It still is a right, but it is no longer a fundamental right. Okay. So today it exercises and enjoys the status of a constitutional right or a legal right. Just write down one more line. I'll explain that later. So today the status of fundamental right. Today the status of the right to property. Today the status of the right to property is no longer a fundamental right. Rather, today the status of right to property is no longer a fundamental right. It is merely a constitutional or a legal right. It's merely a constitutional or a legal right. It's merely a constitutional or a legal right. So to make you understand all these things, I'll have to explain a little bit about Article 300A, which I'll subsequently do that. So is it clear to all of you as to what is fundamental right? What is a basic distinction as to something which is mentioned in Part 3 of the Constitution and outside Part 3 of the Constitution? Any other right? Okay. So the difference is that you can directly approach the Supreme Court. So now we'll move to the next thing. So write down the next thing, that is fundamental duties. So fundamental duties is the next thing that you're going to understand. What is the basic difference between a fundamental right and a fundamental duty? So what is the thing that you have understood with regard to the fundamental right? Who exercise and enjoys a fundamental right? Citizens, in certain cases for the aliens as well. Not only to the citizens, which will subsequently understand, but yes, majorly citizen. So what is the objective of this fundamental right? To limit the powers of the state, and thereby you empower the citizens. And whenever these rights are violated or they justiciable in nature, can the affected individuals move to the court? In fact, they can move to the court, including the Supreme Court of India. So similar to that, they brought one more concept. In fact, this fundamental duty was not part of the original Constitution. Although there were some debates in the Constituent Assembly, but it never became part of the original Constitution. But subsequently, this fundamental duty was brought into the Constitution. And do you know when this fundamental duty was inserted into the Constitution? Anyone? What do you understand by the word duties? And who is supposed to perform these duties as per the idea of fundamental duties? Duties, you can say some obligations that you are supposed to, expected to fulfill certain obligations. That's basically what is a duty. So if you see that there was no such provision called as a fundamental duty in the original Constitution, but the very idea of fundamental duties was inserted into the Constitution by the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act in 1976. By then government, the Congress government, which was headed by Indira Gandhi at that point of time. And this was also the time of emergency. If you remember, I said there were 3 national emergencies in our country. And this was a time when there was 3rd national emergency. The 3rd national emergency was during the time of 1975 to 1977. This is the time the 3rd national emergency was imposed. Now, what happened during this time? There are a lot of people, you know, that one of the consequences of national emergency is the fundamental rights can be suspended. People can be oppressed because the state becomes too powerful when there's an emergency. And because of a lot of actions by the state, the consequence was people started destroying the public property. So that is when the government thought that, yes, we'll have to bring in some duties as a part of the citizens. That is why you'll understand that one of the duty of the citizens is also not to damage the public property and all those things. So a committee was constituted under the leadership of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi, and which was headed by then a cabinet minister who was called as Swaran Singh. So it was the Swaran Singh committee which recommended, yes, we'll amend the constitution and we'll bring in a specific part into the constitution that will be titled as what is called as the fundamental duties. So in 1976, the constitution was amended by the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act under the recommendation of Swaran Singh committee. So try to remember this. All these questions are asked in the prelims examination. Swaran Singh committee. So based on the recommendation which was given by, Swaran Singh committee. Swaran Singh committee, the constitution was amended, and by 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act, a new part was inserted into the constitution. What is the name of that particular part? Part 4A. Part 4A was inserted, and a new article was inserted, that is Article 51A. A new part was inserted, a new article was inserted, and they placed 10 duties for the citizens. How many duties were placed? 10 duties were placed. So today, how many duties are there? Today, there are 11 duties. So initially, 10 duties were placed. So this placed 10 duties for the citizens, and initially, finally, one more duty was added by the 86th Constitutional Amendment Act in 2003. So the 11th duty was added. So today there are 11 fundamental duties for the citizens. So basically, what do you mean by duty? Now coming back to the concept of duty, what do you mean by duty? Duty are certain obligations, but you understand that the way that the fundamental duties has been inserted, these are basically what? These are obligations for whom? These are obligations for the citizens. Can anyone tell me some of the fundamental duties that you know? Now, this is a very simple topic. They may not ask you much questions in the mains examination, but as in your prelims, they can ask you. They can give you some fundamental duties, they can give you some fundamental rights, and they'll ask you to identify which is a fundamental right, which is a fundamental duty. And in between, they can mix some directive principles also. So as a student preparing for civil service, you should be in a position to clearly identify which is a fundamental right, which is a fundamental duty, which is the directive principles of state policy. So in that way, they can ask you, can you tell me some of the fundamental duty, whatever you are aware of? It's not right to promote, it is a duty to promote. It's a duty to promote communal harmony. Okay. Any other duty? Duty to respect national anthem, national flag. Duty to have scientific temper. Duty to render national service when called upon to do so. Duty to respect women and not to do anything that is derogatory to the dignity of women. So in this way, number of duty has been guaranteed, or number of duty has been imposed. But my question is, what if a citizen fail to perform these duties? See, when the state is taking away your rights, you can enforce it in a court of law. But as a citizen, you fail to perform these duties, then what is likely to happen? Or in other words, I'm just trying to ask whether these duties are legal obligations or moral obligations. What do you mean by moral obligations? Moral obligation means that there is no legal liability. See, you as a citizens are supposed to perform these duties, but if you're not performing these duties, then the state cannot enforce this in a court of law. The state cannot take any action against you. Okay, so these are obligations, no doubt, but these are just what? Moral obligations. These are just moral obligations. That means if the citizens are not performing their duties, it cannot be enforced in a court of law. That's a basic understanding we should have. And one more difference is, these duties are only to the citizens, not to the aliens. If any alien is living in India, they are not liable to, even it is not their moral obligation. But whereas some fundamental rights are exercisable by both citizens as well as the aliens. Okay, so these are the basic understanding you should have with regard to the fundamental duties. So the question comes with your basic understanding, is the fundamental duties justiciable in nature? Are they justiciable in nature? Or the legal obligation or moral obligation? They are just a moral obligation and not a legal obligation. But what about the fundamental rights? Can that be justiciable in a court of law? They are very much justiciable in a court of law. All right. So this is the basic understanding you should have with regard to the duty. Now come to the last thing, that is the directive principles of state policy. Directive principles of state policy. Can anyone tell me in which part of the Constitution the directive principles of state policy is mentioned? Very good. It is in part 4 of the Constitution. And what is your understanding of directive principles? What do you mean by directive? Directions. Directions that will enable or help someone the way they conduct themselves. Or you can say guidelines. Or you can say advisories. So sometimes when you appear for the examination, your college or the university will give you some advice as to what are the do's and what are the don'ts. So probably the way that you have to conduct. When you get the UPSC hall ticket, probably when you appear for the examination, you will understand that there are certain do's and don'ts. As someone who's appearing for the examination, what you are supposed to carry, what you are not supposed to carry, what you are supposed to do, what you are not supposed to do. These are all some advisories, or these are all some directives. Now, similarly, such directives are given in the Constitution as well. And these directives are for whom? These directives are for the state. These directives are not for the people. These directives are for the state. When the Constituent Assembly drafted the Constitution, 1947, India became independent. A nascent democracy is going to come out of this wonderful Constitution. But then we never ruled ourselves. For the last 200 years, it was through a British rule. Some foreigner were ruling our country, and suddenly we are becoming independent. Huge responsibility is there for that newly elected democratic government. So the members of the Constituent Assembly thought that the new government should have some guidelines as to how to carry out the administrative affairs. The newly elected government, if they can have some directions in the Constitution itself, and if they start implementing these directions, the idea is that it will lead to what is called as a welfare state. Does anyone understand what is the concept of welfare state? A welfare state is something which cares for the welfare of the people, which tries to ensure equality, which tries to ensure justice, which tries to bring in equality in terms of social, economic, and political aspects. So try to understand that in order to ensure a welfare state, if the government does not have any idea as to what should I do, you just start implementing the directives. You just try to start following the directives that is given in part 4 of the Constitution. And for the very purpose, the directives has been laid down in the Constitution itself, which has been mentioned from article. Does anyone know what are the articles covered here? Article 36 to Article 51 of the Constitution, which is basically a lot of philosophical ideas as a directives. And these directives are for whom? These directives are for the state. When I say state, it includes the government, it includes the parliament to make laws, the government as to how to implement those laws. So once you follow these directives, automatically it will result in what? It will result in the welfare of the people. So such directives has been given in the Constitution. But the most important thing that you have to understand is, what if these directives, so it is an obligation for the state. So the duties are obligation for whom? Citizens. But it is a moral obligation or legal obligation? Moral obligation. Similarly, the directives are obligations for the state. So once the state, to be very specific here, the government, and if the government start implementing these directives, automatically it will lead to the welfare of the people. But my question is whether these obligations are binding or non-binding, or in other words, whether it is a moral obligation, it is a legal obligation. Or in other words, if these directions are not implemented by the state, can the citizens go to the court and get it enforced? They cannot get it enforced. These are just what? These are just moral obligations for the state. If the state want, they can implement that. If the state is not implementing that, nothing can be done about it. In fact, do you know that the father of Indian Constitution, who is considered to be the father of Indian Constitution? It was Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who himself was the chairman of the drafting committee. In fact, he was very much in favor of making these directives as a moral obligation. He was not in favor of making this as a legal obligation. Now, why do you think that he was not in favor? You might think that if it is made a legal obligation, definitely the state has to ensure all these things. But then Dr. B.R. Ambedkar was not in favor of making this as a legal obligation, but rather he made it as a moral obligation. Why? Moral obligation means they can do it or they may not do it. It is up to the government to do it or not to do it. If the government does it, it is well and fine. If the government is not doing it, we as a people cannot do anything about it. So how many of you think that it should have been made as a legal obligation? Anybody who's having that idea, no, it would have been better if it is made as a legal obligation. That means you're all agreeing with the idea that the moral obligation is better. Why? Because you think that probably Dr. B.R. Ambedkar had more knowledge than what you possess right now. Is that the reason? Or you actually know the reason as to why he has said that? Very good. You can be comfortable also, although I will not talk in Hindi, but if you're not comfortable talking in English, you can communicate in Hindi also. I can comfortably understand that. The idea is I wanted you to talk, because the more you talk, as in when I say talk, a purposeful conversation, not otherwise. The more you talk in the class, it is also going to help build your personality, which is going to help you in performing in the interview process. Because for the interview process, it is not that after your mains, you will go for a tremendous change in your personality. So the moment you started preparing for the examination, it's a gradual process. From now on, you start building your personality. Then only we will have a gradual change. Your personality cannot be molded just within a month. Ultimately, why most of the students, they feel that they have done well in the interview. And when the marks come out, they feel that it's less. And I have spoken to many students, sir, I do not know an answer to all the questions, but still my mark is less. Now you tell me that why someone has answered, just I'll take a couple of minutes, okay? Then I'll come back. Now you tell me that why someone who has answered all the questions, but still his mark is less. Yes? Confidence and way of speaking. That means you mean to say the answers are not awarded to the answers. To something else, the marks are awarded. What is a test? It's a personality test. It is not a test of your knowledge, which is almost already tested in the other process during the other stage. In your mains examination, nobody is going to evaluate you in terms of your personality. There's a paper called as ethics. And you may be an ethically, morally a corrupt person, but still if you're able to put a right answer, you can come out with flying colors. There's no problem with that. Because there nobody can evaluate your personality. But then there's a stage where your personality is to be evaluated, not your intelligence is to be evaluated. And that stage is what is the personality test. So it is not about what you answer. It is not about answering all the questions unless and until they feel that as you are a material for the country, you are someone who will take care of the welfare of the people, or they feel that as you have that kind of caliber, you will be able to possess that personality to implement the policies, or you'll be honest. You will have the utmost integrity in whatever you say. It doesn't matter, even if you're not able to answer, let us assume 50% of the questions, it doesn't matter. Because all that they are going to assess is your personality. And how your personality is getting reflected? Only when you open your mouth. Otherwise, you will have to let them know that, yes, I am a person. You cannot just sit silently there with all integrity and then they cannot award you marks, even if you have the best of potential. You will have to communicate to them, and through that communication, they have to understand. So it's very important that you open up and you speak. And especially when you are going to be a civil servant. That doesn't mean that when you get into the services, you always go to the media and just speak a lot of things. So that's a different thing, different story altogether. Because there's something which is called as civil services neutrality. And there is something which is called as civil services anonymity. So yes, in the interview, you'll have to talk to the extent that they understand your personality. But when you get into service, there is something which is called as anonymity. What do you understand by civil services anonymity? Maintaining or in other words, work from behind the curtain. Anonymity means you have to work from behind the curtain. You cannot go and tell the minister doesn't know anything. I am the one who has formulated all the policy. So all the credit goes to me. No. You are just going to advise the minister. And even if it is a successful program, the credit will be taken by the minister. If the program is an utter flop, the minister has to take the blame also. That is what is the principle of what is called as the minister cannot blame you for the flop of a particular initiative or program because you are just an advisory body to him. So ultimate authority is taken in a democracy by the minister. You should follow the principle of anonymity also. Okay. So the idea that I'm telling is to score well in the interview, you need to talk, you need to communicate. That is very important. So try to start talking in front of others. So gradual confidence will also improve. Okay. Yes, I know that most of you might not have done this. Probably there was no need to do that. But now on, if you are serious about this examination, so try to gradually communicate. Because in the interview, it will not suddenly come. It cannot be changed in a very short period of time. All right. So coming back to the directive principles. Okay. So coming to, just give me a moment. Okay. So just come here. So what is this directive principles of state policy? It's an obligation. It is an obligation for whom? It is an obligation for the state. That means it's just a moral obligation. So I was coming to this question that why it was made as a moral obligation. Very good. All these directives were very idealistic in nature. If all these directives would have been implemented, it would become an utopian state, a model state, which is not very possible for a nascent democracy like India, which was not having much resources to implement all those things. So it was extremely high level of directives, which when the state was not having the resources to do that. So Dr. B.R. Ambedkar said, let us put it as a moral obligation. So as and when the state will have the resources, once they have more money to spend, when the resources increase, probably the tax collection by the state increases, they can gradually implement whenever they want. But at the same time, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar said that though it is a moral obligation, no state can undermine these directives. If the state is going to undermine, if any government is going to undermine and take it lightly, it is only for the peril of the own government. That is what Dr. B.R. Ambedkar concluded his speech in the Constituent Assembly. Why he said that no government can take this lightly? Although it is moral obligation, nobody can question them in a court of law. But Dr. B.R. Ambedkar idea is that in a democracy which goes for periodic elections, so every 5 years, any government is answerable to the electorate. People who are voting in the elections, they are answerable to the electorate, because if any government is not taking any attention in implementing these directives, people are going to vote that government out of power. So although it is not a legal obligation, but it cannot be taken lightly. So they have to take it seriously. But because there is no resources, we will keep this as what? We will keep this as a moral obligation. That means the entire directive principles of state policy is what? It is non-justiciable in character. So now try to make a comparison between the fundamental rights, DPSP, and the directive principles of state policy. So which is justiciable in nature? Fundamental rights. What about fundamental duties? What about directive principles of state policy? Non-justiciable in nature. Okay. So in addition to all those things, if you look into the entire directive principles of state policy, there's no segregation as to the directive principles of state policy to be socialistic, Gandhian principles, liberal intellectual principles in the constitution. But then if you see these directives had different ideas. Some ideas are socialistic in character. What do you mean by socialistic in character? When I say some ideas are socialistic in character, it was with the idea of redistribution of wealth in the society. It was of the idea that if somebody is rich, property can be taken from him and it can be distributed to others. So these ideas were majorly socialistic, which were taking care of the working class, which was taking care of the poorer sections. There were certain ideas which are socialistic in character. There were certain ideas which are Gandhian in character, which was reflecting the philosophy of Gandhiji. Can you tell me some of the directives which were Gandhian in character? Establishment of Panchayati Raj, institutions of Panchayati Raj, cottage, promotion of cottage industries, cooperative societies, and then prevention of intoxicating drinks, state putting restrictions upon selling of intoxicating drinks. So these are all ideas which are Gandhian in nature. And some of the ideas were liberal and intellectual in nature. That means these ideas were far ahead of the time. Say, for example, they were thinking about protecting the environment at that point of time. They were talking about an uniform civil code. So if you talk of uniform civil code way back in 1940s or in 1950s, now think there are, even now people are not accepting the uniform civil code. But then the idea of uniform civil code was there in the Directive Principles of State Policy, which is part of the liberal intellectual principles. So try to understand, there are a lot of directives, but the Constitution does not classify these directives. The Constitution does not classify these directives, but it is only for our own understanding. These principles are classified into three types. What are the three classifications we have? What are the classification? Socialistic, Gandhian, and liberal intellectual. These are the way by which the directives are classified. Okay. So try to understand, is the Directive Principles of State Policy justiciable in nature? Is it a legal obligation or a moral obligation? Please be louder. It's a moral obligation. Is there any classification of the DPSP in the Constitution? But however, it is classified for academic purpose for our own understanding as the socialistic principle, Gandhian principle, and the liberal intellectual principles. Was it there in the original Constitution, this Directive Principles of State Policy? Was it there? It was there in the original Constitution. What about the fundamental duties? Was it there in the original Constitution? It was not there in the original Constitution. All right. So just few more basics that we'll have to complete, and then we'll move on to the next part. Okay, so come to the next topic, that is secular state. Write down the next topic, that is secular state. Any questions so far? Quickly go ahead. Yes, of course, judiciary is an independent judiciary. Which one?
First of all, we are independent. I want to ask the question that if there is a separation between Supreme Court and High Court, problem of Supreme Court, High Court में कुछ है, one of the things
No, your questions, I think it is there in your mind, but I'm not able to comprehend what you wanted to exactly ask. You mean to say if there's any conflict between the High Court and the Supreme Court? The conflict cannot arise because the Supreme Court is a superior authority. The Supreme Court has the power to overrule whatever has been said by the High Court. The High Court cannot say that we will not follow your rules and regulations. And that is what is a single hierarchy of judiciary. There's a hierarchy of judiciary. In fact, as per the Constitution, any judgment which is given by the Supreme Court, is it binding upon all the High Courts? It is binding upon all the High Courts in our country. The High Courts cannot say no. That is what we call as a hierarchy of courts. Who is sitting at the apex of the judiciary? The Supreme Court. The Supreme Court passes judgment. It is binding upon all the High Courts in our country. Okay, High Court is passing an order. Is it binding upon the other subordinate courts? It is binding upon all the other subordinate courts within that particular state. Suppose let us assume the Madras High Court is passing an order, and then let us assume there is a High Court in Andhra Pradesh. Is the Madras High Court order binding upon Andhra Pradesh? The High Court order is binding only in that particular state. But what about an order which is passed by the Supreme Court? It is binding upon all the High Courts. Okay, so the conflict cannot arise. Superior authority has been given to the Supreme Court. That's why we call that to be a single hierarchy of judiciary. When you talk of independent judiciary, who can explain me what is independent judiciary? Free from the control of the other organs of the state. What are the other organs? Legislature and the executive. Okay, so come to the next thing, that is secular state. Okay, I wanted you to explain the idea of what is called as a secular state. So many times we talk of what is called as the word secularism or the secular state. Do you agree the fact that India is a secular state? Do you agree with the fact? Okay, then tell me, what is a secular state when you call something as secular?
government treats everyone equally.
The government treats everyone equally. Or in other words, the state does not discriminate in terms of religion. Okay, the state does not discriminate in terms of religion. Let us assume the state has no policies to discriminate on the basis of religion. But the most important thing is, can a state have its religion? Can a state have an official religion for itself? Do we have an official flag? Do we have an official language? Do we have official language in our country? How many of you think that we do not have an official language? Please raise your hand. Do we have a national language? Okay, I'm asking two things. One is official language, national language. Out of these two things, one is recognized by the Constitution. What is recognized in the Constitution? The Constitution does recognize an official language. Today, as per the Constitution of India, the official language is both Hindi and English. Initially, it was given Hindi, but for the first 15 years of time, English is also to be the official language. But then if the parliament wants to make a law, and by that law, they can extend this English for more time. So the law has been made, and today, both English and Hindi continue to be an official language. But try to understand, there's no concept of national language. There's nothing which is called as a national language. Only official language is there in the Indian Constitution, which is to be used for the official purpose, for the government orders and all those things. You use the official language. So similarly, do we have an official I would say symbol for our country, national emblem or something? Do you have an official? Do you have a national animal, national flower? So do you have a national language, something recognized? Do you have a national religion which is recognized under the Constitution? So these things are not recognized. So what do you understand by secular state? So secular state concept is very simple. It is not only that the state does not discriminate people on the basis of religion, but the state does not identify itself with any religion. The state has no official religion in the first place. The state, irrespective of the religion that is followed in the country, the state cannot claim today it is an Islamic state. There are some countries which call them as an Islamic state. But can India claim like that? That is not possible under the Constitution. Maybe some individuals may say, but that is not possible under the Constitution because the Constitution does not allow for that. Because India is what is called as a secular state. So what do you understand by secularism? Please write down. Secularism or secular state. Secular means the state is non-religious in character. Secular means the state is non-religious in character. And secular means the state is non-religious in character, and it also does not discriminate, people on the basis of religion. And it also does not discriminate on the basis of religion. And it also does not discriminate on the basis of religion. Okay, so that's a basic understanding you should have. But when I move to the topic of preamble, I'll discuss more about this concept of secularism. It's very early for you to directly get into all those things. But as of now, the preliminary understanding means what is secularism? The state does not have an official religion. The state also does not discriminate people on the basis of religion, be it a majority religion or a minority religion. Every sections of the society has to be treated equally. That is what the Constitution says. Come to the next concept. What is the next concept? Universal adult suffrage. So what do you understand by this universal adult suffrage? So write down the Constitution guarantees. Write down the Constitution guarantees. The Constitution guarantees that all adult individuals. The Constitution guarantees that all the adult individuals who have attained 18 years of age. The Constitution guarantees that all the adult individual who has attained 18 years of age, shall have the right to vote. Shall have the right to vote without any discrimination. Without any discrimination. Without any discrimination. That's basically what is called as adult suffrage. Come to the next thing, single citizenship. Write down the next concept, single citizenship. Okay, now before I proceed further, this topic of single citizenship, How many of you in this class are sure that you are a citizen of India? So why I ask this particular question is, do you know that as per UPSC notification, only the citizen of India can appear for this examination? Some services, even the subjects of Nepal, Bhutan, they can also appear. But of course, if you're aiming for the All India services and other important central services like the foreign service, you should be an Indian citizen. Now, it should not happen that you prepared for 2-3 years, you cleared the examination, and then UPSC or probably DOPT is rejecting your candidature that you are not an Indian citizen, because all these verifications will be done only by in the end. Now, initially, it is only a self-declaration. Okay, how many of you are sure? Please raise your hand that you are a citizen of India. Sure? Okay, how will you prove that? If I ask you that, okay, how do you know that you are a citizen of India? You possess an Aadhaar card? Now, for your kind information, Aadhaar is not a proof of citizenship. Aadhaar is only a proof of your address. And Aadhaar is not only given to the citizen, Aadhaar can be given to any resident in India. A foreigner who is staying in India, he can also apply and enroll and get an Aadhaar card. So if you just possess that and your Aadhaar card, and if you say that I'm a citizen of India, then probably you'll have to go and verify that whether you possess a citizenship or not. But that doesn't mean that you are not a citizen. I'm sure that you are a citizen of India. But my question is, how do you say that? What is your understanding of that? That's my question. Fulfilled. So do you know what is the criteria that is given in the Constitution? All right. Somebody was saying, okay, I'll come back to your answer. Somebody said, what is that you said? Voter ID card. Birth certificate. Okay, coming back to the birth certificate. Okay, so tomorrow let us assume that a foreign couple is coming here and they give birth to a child in India. So the government will issue a birth certificate to the child also. The child is entitled to get a birth certificate. So do you mean that somebody who's having a birth certificate in India is an Indian citizen? So then all of you have said that you are a citizen of India. So my question is how? How do you say that you are a citizen of India?
Parents and all were living.
Your parents and your forefathers were living in India. Okay. Okay, so what is the proof that you have? Do you have any identity card that puts you that you are a citizen of India? For a citizen, do you have any specific identity card as a citizen of India? There's no citizenship card that is issued by the government. Although, as per the Citizenship Act, the government should maintain a register. That is why the NRC process is happening, but no ID card is issued per se. But it is only that it is implied that you are a citizen of India through most of the other rights that you exercise and enjoy in our country. So, for example, I think most of you might have registered your name or enrolled your name in the electoral roll, and most of you might have a voter ID. So, voter ID means you are a citizen of India. But having a voter ID, that does not make you a citizen of India. Try to understand. Because you are a citizen of India, that voting rights were given to you. In the first place, you are a citizen, and that's why that voter ID card was given to you. Because you are a citizen of India, you were having the passport. You are having the passport issued by the Indian authorities today. So my question is, there has to be some criteria you should have fulfilled in the first place that made you a citizen. So now I just wanted to know that. As to how you can claim that, yes, I'm a citizen of India. How you can proudly say, yes, I'm a citizen of India. So I do exercise the rights that is guaranteed in the Constitution. Very good. Born in India plus Indian parents. So this is the criteria which most of you will fit in, but that's not the only criteria. There is a number of criteria. So, but the point is, we'll not discuss all these things at this stage. I'll discuss all these things when I take you to the chapter called as citizenship. But right now, you should have an idea that our Constitution provides for only what is called as a single citizenship. So what do you understand by the word citizenship in the first place? And then what is a single citizenship? What do you understand by the word citizenship? Write down a line as to what is citizenship. It's a legal relationship between. Citizenship is a legal relationship Citizenship is a legal relationship between the state and the religion. Sorry, between the state and the citizen. Sorry, make a small correction. It's a legal relationship between the state and the religion. It's a legal relationship between the state and the citizen. Sorry, make a correction. Legal relationship between the state and the citizen. State and the citizen. The Constitution of India right now. The Constitution of India recognizes single citizenship. That is citizenship of India. The Constitution of India recognizes single citizenship, that is citizenship of India. It does not provide. Okay, what is the last line that you read? The Constitution of India provides for single citizenship, that is citizenship of India, irrespective of, just write down after that, irrespective of single citizenship, irrespective of the state one belongs to. Irrespective of the state one belongs to, that means irrespective of wherever he is a resident. He might be a resident of state of Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Karnataka, Kerala, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, it does not matter. Wherever he is a resident, he is likely to get only one citizenship, that is citizenship of India. Unlike certain other countries, say United States of America, which provides for dual citizenship. One at the national level, one at the national level, and one at the state level. One at the national level and one at the state level. The single citizenship was chosen. The single citizenship was chosen by the members of the Constituent Assembly. The single citizenship was chosen by the members of the Constituent Assembly in order to ensure the fraternity among the citizens. In order to ensure the fraternity among the citizens. In order to ensure fraternity. Have you heard of this word, fraternity? F-R-A-T-E-R-N-I-T-Y. In order to ensure fraternity among the citizens, thereby ensuring the unity and integrity of the nation. Thereby ensuring the unity and integrity of the nation. Thereby ensuring the unity and integrity of nation. Now, what do you understand by the word fraternity? In order to ensure the brotherhood among the citizens. See, what was the thought in the Constituent Assembly is, they thought that if they give dual citizenship, let us assume one citizenship of India, say let us assume one citizenship of Tamil Nadu, one citizenship of India, say one citizenship of Uttar Pradesh, one citizenship of India, say one citizenship of Jammu and Kashmir. If that has happened, if that is likely to happen, the Constituent Assembly thought the regional identity would be the primary identity than the national identity. That is likely to happen in a diverse country like India. So if the regional identity would be the primary identity, then you cannot ensure the feeling of brotherhood among all the Indians. So they thought that we'll go for only one citizenship. Although some of the federal political system like USA, they do provide for dual citizenship. But then what is the primary difference between USA and India when it comes? So they are also federal political system. How they were able to give a dual citizenship while India was not able to give a dual citizenship? One is we wanted to ensure fraternity, and there also they would like to have a fraternity, but still they have a dual citizenship. So why that was happening in USA but not in India? for which you'll have to understand the world history also. You'll have to understand about the American Revolution. Probably you'll read in the history as I do not know how important or how relevant it is to a civil service. But if you look into the history, you understand that unlike India, the United States of America never existed as a single country. If you look into even the Britishers, when they came to India, or even before that, today, whatever is part of India, even much larger territory was there in British India. And they existed as one single nation for a long period of time, if you look into the history. But unlike this, if you look into United States of America, today, how many states are there in United States of America? So 50 states approximately, let us assume that these 50 states never existed as one single country. They were all small nations. And then subsequently, they realized that united, they are a better force. They can resist probably the Europeans. And then these smaller states came together and they formed a larger nation after the American Revolution. So when the nation, when they were willing to cooperate and come together as one single nation, they said that we also need an identity and citizenship for our own state. Unless until you guarantee this in the constitution, this coming together will never happen. And that's why the American Constitution, it is also said it is a coming together federation. And on the contrary, how do you call the Indian, the state, the nations, the India as a holding together federation? Our federation is called as holding together. They are a coming together federation. So because of all these reasons, they had it, but we are not having that. Okay. Okay. What is the next thing that we'll discuss? Come to the next thing, that is independent bodies. So write down the next thing, that is independent bodies. What do you mean by independent bodies? As the name suggests, that apart from the three important organs of the state, what are the three important organs of the state as per the concept of separation of powers that you have learned? The legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. So apart from these three important organs of the state, to play a very specific role, a lot of independent bodies has been given. And they have a very specific role to perform. And these independent bodies, which are established by the constitution, and they are supposed to perform a specific role. And these independent bodies are also called as the constitutional bodies. Say, for example, the independent bodies like the Election Commission of India, the Finance Commission, the National Commission for Scheduled Caste, National Commission for Scheduled Tribes, and the Comptroller and Auditor General. So a lot of independent bodies which are supposed to perform a specific role under the constitution. And why they are called as independent bodies? These independent bodies, they directly derive their powers from the constitution, and they are directly established by the constitution. Okay, so that's why these bodies are called as independent bodies. Okay, just write down a line. So we'll deal with these things also at the later stages. So apart from the three important organs of the state, so write down, apart from the three important organs of the state, apart from the three important organs of the state, that is the legislature, the judiciary, and the executive. Apart from the three important organs of the state, that is the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, the constitution also allows for the establishment of certain independent bodies. The constitution allows for the establishment of certain independent bodies to perform certain specific function, under the constitution. To perform certain specific function under the constitution. For example, the Election Commission of India is established under Article 324. The Election Commission of India is established under Article 324 and derives its power from the Constitution. Derives its power from the Constitution to ensure free and fair election in our democratic system. And derives power from the Constitution to ensure free and fair elections in our democratic system. Free and fair elections in our democratic system. And the Election Commission of India is completely free in its functioning completely free in its functioning. With respect to carrying, sorry, the Election Commission of India is completely free in its functioning. The Election Commission of India is completely free from, within bracket you write, from the other organs of the state. What are the other organs of the state? That is the legislature, the executive and judiciary. They're completely free from the other organs of the state in terms of its function. So just read the last line. I'll just see. Can anyone read the last line? The Election Commission of India is completely free from the other organs of the state, that is the legislature, executive and judiciary, with regard to its functioning. So you can write other examples. Other examples include the Office of the Comptroller and Auditor General under Article 280. Sorry, 148. So make a small correction. The Comptroller and Auditor General under Article 148. Finance Commission. Article 280. Union Public Service Commission. Article 315. National Commission for Scheduled Caste. Article 338. National Commission for Scheduled Caste, Article 338. National Commission for Scheduled Tribes, Article 338A. National Commission for Backward Classes, Article 338B. Article 338B. So these are all some of the examples of independent bodies. And all these independent bodies do have a specific role to play. And they are also called as constitutional bodies. So write down, they are also called as what? They are also called as constitutional bodies. They are also called as constitutional bodies. Okay, so what do you understand by a constitutional body? These constitutional bodies are independent in nature. So what do you understand by the term constitutional bodies? They derive their power from the Constitution. Okay, so not only they derive their power from the Constitution, they are directly established by the Constitution. The Constitution establishes this body and they also derive the powers from the Constitution. Okay, such bodies are what is called as constitutional bodies. So sometimes students have a misunderstanding that these bodies are mentioned in the Constitution. Something is mentioned in the Constitution, that does not make that as a constitutional body. When it becomes a constitutional body, it is established by the Constitution, not just mentioned in the Constitution. It is established by the Constitution, then it becomes a constitutional body. For example, the word political parties is mentioned in the Constitution. If you will discuss about the anti-defection law, which I'll later discuss, there's something which is called as anti-defection law. If you go to Schedule 10 of the Constitution, there's a mention of word political parties. Does the political parties in India are a constitutional bodies? Just because something is mentioned, they are not constitutional bodies. They have to be established by the Constitution. And by establishing them, a specific role has to be assigned in the Constitution itself. So such bodies are called as constitutional bodies. And most of these constitutional bodies are independent in nature. And what do you mean by independent in nature? They are free from the other organs of the state. Come to the last thing, that is emergency provisions. Write down emergency provision. Just write a line about the emergency provisions. And then I'll explain briefly about that. These are extraordinary provisions in the Constitution. These are extraordinary provisions in the Constitution. To meet out certain unforeseen circumstances. To meet out certain unforeseen circumstances. Okay, can you just think of some unforeseen circumstances? I said that these are extraordinary provisions in the Constitution, which were placed in the Constitution to meet out some unforeseen circumstances. What could be the unforeseen circumstances? Okay, like disaster. What are general unforeseen circumstances? Then I'll say what is mentioned in the Constitution. War, very good. War. Rebellion, armed rebellion in large scale. Say, for example, today Maoist rebellion is there, which is very measurable, controllable by the state. But today, let us assume that in every state there is a Maoist rebellion against the state. Then that becomes an emergency situation. War, external aggression. What do you mean by external aggression? And what is war? There is a distinction between war and external aggression. Although you use that interchangeably, there's a slight difference between these two things. War is bilateral. That means there's an action and there's a reaction. And then it becomes a war. What is external aggression? Aggression is unilateral in nature. Before the other party could respond, one party is attacking, and that becomes an external aggression. And then once we start responding to that, probably it becomes a war. So the unforeseen circumstances that I'm talking about could be war or external aggression or an armed rebellion within the state. Or there's a financial crisis within the country. So financial crisis means tomorrow the government is not having the revenue to trade with foreign countries. The government is not having the foreign exchange to trade with the foreign countries. The government is going through a huge deficit where the revenue is very less and expenditure is very high. So there could be a financial crisis also. So what is the need to have this emergency provisions? I say these are extraordinary provisions in the Constitution, and which may be used under certain circumstances. So normally they are very dormant. These provisions are not used unless until the situation arises. So when those situation arises, what is dormant becomes active. And then when they become active, the Constitution goes for a transformation. So how the Constitution goes for a transformation? Otherwise, which is a federal political system, mostly they become unitary in character. That means when it becomes unitary in character, who become all more powerful? The union become all more powerful. Okay, so that's basically the idea of the emergency provision. So what is the line that you have written? Just repeat me the line. Unforeseen circumstances such as, write down, such as war, external aggression, armed rebellion, financial crisis, etc. Financial crisis, etc. Whenever the emergency is proclaimed, write down, whenever the emergency is proclaimed, the Constitution goes for a transformation. Whenever the emergency is proclaimed, or you can write whenever the emergency is proclaimed by the President of India, because the President of India has authority to proclaim the emergency. Whenever the emergency is proclaimed by the President of India, the Constitution goes for a transformation from a federal political system to unitary in character. From a federal political system to unitary in character. From a federal political system to unitary in character. From a federal political system to unitary in character. As per the Constitution of India, there are three types of emergencies that can be proclaimed. So just write down the emergency right now. One is the national emergency. Other is the state emergency. Or president rule. And then you have the financial emergency. This much is sufficient as of now. What these emergencies are, what kind of changes happen, I'll explain you later. Okay, so right now you should understand as to what the emergency provisions are. Is that clear to all of you? What is this emergency? But what happens, what is common to all the three types of emergencies? The Constitution goes for a transformation. How they go for a transformation? They transform themselves from a federal political system to unitary in character. although it depends upon the type of emergency. So for example, national emergency has the highest degree of transformation. It completely becomes unitary. In case of state emergency or a president rule, there's a partial transformation. And then in case of financial emergency, even there's a lesser degree of transformation. But they vary only in terms of degree. But definitely there's a shift from a federal political system to a unitary political system. All right. So what are the things that you have covered today? So just come back to the beginning. Online students, you also please come back. So where we have started today. So we have started with the idea of understanding as to what is the difference between a parliamentary system and a presidential system. So what is the very essence of parliamentary system is the accountability of the executive to the legislature. But whereas when it comes to the presidential system, how it is little different? In a presidential system, the element of continuous accountability is not there. Why? Because the executive is independent of the legislature, unlike that in the case of India. So what is the advantage of parliamentary system? Advantage of the presidential system is stability. What is the advantage of parliamentary system? Accountability. So the Constituent Assembly has decided in favor of what? Accountability over stability. That means in terms of stability, the parliamentary system is on the little lower degree. But we are looking for more of accountability. And what is the next topic we have seen? Separation of powers. So this is basically the idea that the power should not be entrusted in one single authority, because power given to one single authority is very dangerous. Have you ever heard of this maxim, or have you ever heard of this particular idea of Lord Acton, who was very popular in United Kingdom? Power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. What does this mean when I say power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely? So you can. It is also said that if to understand the real character of an individual, give him the authority and see how he behaves. Suppose if all the authority under the Constitution is given to one single authority, and what if that authority becomes corrupt? Then it becomes extremely difficult. So the idea is, do not give all the authority to one single person, but rather you distribute the authority to different organs. And that's why we came up with the idea of what is called as the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. So how it is different than that of the kings ruling a country? When the kings were there, they were the centralized authority. And will the king be able to do an arbitrary thing? Is there any checks and balances to control him? There was no checks and balances. But today it is not possible, because the power is distributed to the different organs: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary. But however, in the context of India, that although we have the idea of separation of powers, that there is no strict separation of powers. Rather than strict separation of powers, what do we have? We have strict checks and balances, because there's some element of overlap between the legislature and the executive. But we do have a system of what is called as checks and balances. What is the next thing? Federal political system. So, or division of powers. What does it mean? A federal political system or division of power only means that there are different levels of government. And then all the levels of government, they directly derive the powers from where? From the Constitution. That means there's also an element of decentralization. On the contrary, if you look into unitary political system, the unitary political system, there's no decentralization, but there's only delegation of authority. But then the Constituent Assembly has decided in favor of federation because of the fact that India is a large country, and to administer, they wanted to have decentralized powers. Okay, and then next thing, I think federal with unitary bias. Although there is a federation, this federation is not a true federation, because although there is division of powers, this division of powers is in favor of whom? Or the power balance is in favor of the union government. Less powers are given to the state and more powers are given to the union. Okay, so that's why we say that though this is a federation with unitary bias. What is the next thing? Integrated and independent judiciary. So independent judiciary means that the judiciary can work without any fear from the other organs of the state. How the judiciary is able to do that? Because a lot of constitutional protections are there for the judges, so that they can function independently. In fact, if somebody criticizes a judge, they can be punished for the contempt of the court. So we'll understand all those things later. That means a lot of things are there to protect the independence of judiciary. But at the same time, we call that to be an integrated judiciary. How that is an integrated judiciary? Because we have one single hierarchy of judiciary for the entire country. It is not a separate hierarchy of judiciary for the states and separate hierarchy of judiciary for the center. One single hierarchy of judiciary. What is the next thing? we have a written constitution. Basically, we have one single codified constitution. So once you have a written constitution, then there's an automatic distinction between what is a constitutional law and an ordinary law. Then most of the 10 constitutions are rigid in character. Next thing, borrowed constitution. So most of the ideas of our constitution has been borrowed from the other constitutions of the world. But the bulk of the constitution today is again borrowed from what? Government of India Act 1935. So who can explain me what is this Government of India Act 1935? So we have just learned that the bulk of the constitution is borrowed from the Government of India Act 1935. What is this Government of India Act 1935? This is just the constitution based on which the British India was governed. And in fact, India was governed after independence also based on this Government of India Act 1935 till the time India had its own constitution. Next thing, rigid and flexible. That means that though in general the written constitution is rigid, one of the peculiar feature in Indian constitution is that some of the provisions of the Indian constitution can be amended by a simple procedure. But the rest of the provisions in the constitution requires a complex procedure. Okay, that otherwise is what is called a simple majority and special majority, which we will subsequently learn. Next thing, fundamental rights. So rights are nothing but certain claims and entitlements, but among them the most important thing is fundamental right, which is guaranteed in part 3 of the constitution, which is basically justiciable in nature. So whenever it is violated, the affected individuals can approach directly where? Supreme Court of India. Can they approach the Supreme Court of India for the violation of other rights? It's not possible. But for the violation of fundamental rights, can they approach the high courts also? So that is concurrent. If you want, you can go to the High Court or to the Supreme Court. But if you want, you can go to the Supreme Court also. But that is not possible in case of violation of the other rights. So today we have 6 themes of fundamental rights. In the original constitution, how many themes of fundamental right? What was now deleted from part 3 of the constitution? Right to property, and by which Constitutional Amendment Act? 44th Constitutional Amendment Act 1978. So these things may be asked in the prelims examination. What is the next thing? Fundamental duties. So fundamental duties are what? They are obligations mentioned in the constitution, and they are obligations for whom? The citizens. Is it a moral obligation or a legal obligation? It's a moral obligation. So these things were not part of the original constitution, which was subsequently inserted by the 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act in 1976. Initially, there were 10 duties. Today, there are 11 duties. Next thing, Directive Principles of State Policy. Again, these are directions to ensure what is called as a welfare state. And these directions are for the state. And this is again non-justiciable in character. Okay. And if you look into that, these directives, for the purpose of our own understanding, they are classified into socialistic, Gandhian, and liberal intellectual, but such classification is not there in the constitution. Secular state. What do you understand by secular state? Anyone? Please participate. What do you understand by the idea of secular state? The state does not identify itself with any religions. That's basically the idea of the secular state. So can the state discriminate on the basis of religion? The state can also not discriminate on the basis of religion. Okay. So that's the idea of secular state. But yes, secularism, I'll explain a little bit more when I take up the preamble. For example, how many of you heard that in India we follow what is called as a positive secularism, which is different from the idea of what is called as negative secularism, which is followed in the Western countries? Have you ever heard of this? We also follow secularism. Most of the Western countries, most of the democratic countries across the world, they also follow the idea of secularism. But then the kind of secularism today that we follow in India is tailor-made. It is little different from the kind of secularism that is followed in Western countries. What is the difference? I'll explain that later when I take up the preamble. But right now, have a simplest understanding. Secularism means the state is non-religious in character. The state does not discriminate on the basis of religion. What is the next thing? Universal adult suffrage means that every adult individual shall be given the right to vote without any discrimination. So that is your constitutional right. If your constitutional right is violated, can you directly approach the Supreme Court? Probably you can go to the High Court, not to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court directly only when your fundamental rights are violated. Single citizenship. What is the reason as to the single citizenship is given? In order to promote the fraternity. Okay. And if possible, try to research and come that how you are now the citizen of India. So what is the criteria that you satisfy? Probably that you are telling that comfortably that you are a citizen of India. That's the homework for today. So try to make a little bit of research and tell me that, okay, individually, that what is the criteria that you fulfill. So based on which you say that you are a citizen of India. Okay. Anyways, we'll discuss that when I take up the citizenship. So just to bring in a little bit of curiosity in your mind. What is the next thing? Independent bodies. Independent bodies are otherwise also called as what? Constitutional bodies, because these are bodies which are established directly by the Constitution and they directly derive the powers from the Constitution of India. What is the last thing? Emergency provisions. These are extraordinary provisions wherein to meet extraordinary situations, the emergency may be proclaimed by the President of India. So three types of emergency, that is the national emergency, the state emergency or the president rule, and the financial emergency. But irrespective of any of these emergencies, one thing that is common is that the Constitution goes for a transformation. How they go for a transformation? From being a federal political system to a unitary political system. But there are few changes between them, which we'll elaborately study when we deal with the emergency provisions. Okay. So tomorrow what we'll do is you revise all these things. So tomorrow I'll continue with some key terms in polity. So these terms are something that you should have an idea. Say for example, the moment I say the word article, the moment I say the word parts, the moment I say the word schedules, you should be able to comprehend. The moment I use the word first past the post system, the moment I use the word proportional representation, the moment I use the word collegium, the moment I use the word judicial review, the moment I use the word locus standi, the moment I use the word public interest litigation, because these are the words we are going to repeatedly use as we'll proceed. So there are around 20-25 key terms. That is what I'll focus on tomorrow. And if time permits, I'll complete that and I'll move on to the Constituent Assembly. And then after I complete the Constituent Assembly, and then there's something which is called as historical underpinning. What was the background as to how the Constituent background as to how the Constituent Assembly has drafted the Indian Constitution. After covering all these things, it will take me a couple of classes. Then we'll move to what is called as the preamble to the Constitution of India. That is where we are going to start the Constitution. But before going to all those things, you should have a good idea, understanding of all these things. That will help you to grasp most of the things. That also requires a consistent revision from your side. So before coming to the next class, will you revise all these things? Loudly? Okay, so with that, we'll wind up the class. But if you have any questions, I'll just quickly take up your questions and then probably we'll move on. Okay, just give me a moment. There's a question, sir, will these topics like fundamental rights, DPSB be further elaborated in the upcoming classes? Of course. Whatever you have done is like a teaser. This is not the main picture. Of course, fundamental rights I'll teach for like 5-6 classes, around 15-16 hours of classes are there for fundamental rights. You'll have to read each and every single article. Of course, we'll deal with that elaborately, but right now I'm trying to give a basic idea. So how we can cover the fundamental rights with this. It's just to make you understand as to what they are, so that we can move forward. So it will be dealt in detail as we'll proceed further. Any other questions? Is there any disadvantage? One question, so Vaishali has asked me, is there any disadvantage of fundamental duties being a moral obligation? Do you see any disadvantage of fundamental duties being a moral obligation? Moral obligation means what? As a citizen, if you're not performing your duty, the state cannot enforce that. So I put it in this way. So how many of you in this class are performing their duties? All the duties? First of all, any one of you tell me the 11 duties. Then we'll get into the idea that whether you are performing the duties or not. So that means you're not even aware of all the duties. Okay, in fact, in one of my interview, UPSC has asked me this particular question. A very simple question, but very difficult to answer. They asked me that, do you know what is a fundamental duty? And then after going to the interview, somebody is asking this question, you will be very happy to answer a question like, what is fundamental duty? I answer what is a fundamental duty. Then the next question that the panel member asks, tell me some of the fundamental duties that you have not performed. That is the question the person has asked me. That means I'll have to answer that the duty that I'm not performing. So how will it appear as a person who is appearing for the interview board telling them that I'm not performing some of the fundamental duty? But on the contrary, if I say that no, I'm performing all the duty, it will like a blatant lie. So how to tackle this particular question? So that is how UPSC interview becomes an extremely, extremely important thing. It's to determine your personality. Okay, just think of this particular question. If tomorrow you are in the board and somebody is asking you this particular question. Okay, tell me some of the fundamental duties that you have not performed. So how are you going to tackle this particular question? Probably you can think about this also. Okay, so how would you approach? Will you accept to them that yes, that I have not performed these duties, and if you accept that, then there can be a follow-up question. They can ask you that you are not a sincere citizen. How do I expect you to be a good civil servant? And if you say that no, I'm performing all the duty, then they can all catch you on that also. It might appear that it is a lie. So it's a very tricky question to handle. So just put yourself in that position as to how maybe probably you will handle this question if it is there in the interview board. Okay. So we'll discuss about this also probably in the later cases, but just think about that. Okay, so I'll see just if there's any other question. How individual adult suffrage is silent feature of the Constitution? It's not a silent feature. It is explicitly there in Article 326 combined with Article 325 of the Constitution. It is explicitly given in the Constitution. All right, so with that, I'll wind up the class. Any questions from the offline students? Please feel free to ask the questions. Okay. Yes, any High Court order will be binding order only in that particular state. And that order is also binding upon all the subordinate courts within the territory of the concerned state. That's not possible. The High Court order cannot be applied throughout the territory of India because the High Court has jurisdiction only in that particular state. But yes, there could be one concern. Just think about this. There could be one concern. You can think about this. The concern is that we have an integrated judiciary. When we say that integrated judiciary, the judiciary can also interpret the laws made by the parliament. The parliamentary law has application throughout the country. But then a High Court coming and saying that some provisions of the parliamentary law is not valid. So that means the High Court judgment will have effect only on that particular state, while for the other parts of the country, that law can still remain. So such a situation can arise. Just think about this, what will happen in this case, which I'll discuss it tomorrow. That's the only thing that can happen, but a High Court judgment will not have any jurisdiction outside the territory of the concerned state. So under such a case, what is likely to happen? Just think about that. And for the students who are not able to comprehend this, no idea. As we will proceed, we will discuss all those things. Just one last question from student. Sir, on what basis the Constitution Committee had decided that to borrow a specific element from the specific country, which we'll discuss when I take up the topic of Constituent Assembly. Okay. So we're ready to go to that particular topic. Okay. So any questions? All right. So please revise all these things. Thank you very much. Okay. We'll again meet tomorrow.